Okay. All right. So okay, good. Okay, so it's already 1 o'clock. Let's go ahead and resume the meeting from July 27th. Today is a continuation from the July 27th meeting. So we will begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we'll pick up on the item that we stopped off with, which is item 41. So Supervisor Tiffany, if you would mind.
Sure. Ready, salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So item 41 regarding the sales tax.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have on the phone, or on Zoom, I say the phone, Zoom, David Leifer, and he's been working with the county for a few years, for quite a while, and he's been a great asset when it comes to financial outlook, understanding, and assistance when it comes to COPs and other things that we've gone after. He's been instrumental in helping us get our funding for the jail, as well as the behavioral health building. And so I wanted to introduce him to your board. He's going to go ahead and give this presentation, sales tax, as well as a little bit of education on what we could do if there was some finances available, ongoing finances, for certain projects down the road, if your board so chooses to go that direction. So with that, we have David Leifer.
Great, thanks, Ray. And it's a pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can hear you, David.
Very good. Thanks. And good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is David Leifer. I work with the firm KNN Public Finance. Our role is that of a municipal advisor. And what I'd like to do today is three things, as Ray sort of set out. First, I want to provide a brief overview of the debt that the county already has issued and outstanding, and introduce you to some of the types of debt instruments that counties most commonly use should you decide to pursue additional bonding for capital or other needs. Second, we want to jump into that topic of sales tax and provide an overview of how one might go about introducing a new sales tax by the county and what sort of some of the different requirements are, whether you bond against it or not. And then finally, want to provide an overview of the county's rating by Standard & Poor's and sort of the concepts of debt affordability and some of the key metrics that that the bond market and the rating agencies look at. With that, please don't hesitate to jump in with questions as I go, or we can tackle those at the end. Let's see, Gracie, next page, or whoever's working the PowerPoint. Yeah, one more. Okay. Are we able to make that a little bigger? Or no, that looks okay. Are you guys able to see that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we can see
Okay,
it.
great. So just real briefly, just what our role is in this. As Ray said, we are the county's municipal advisor. We've worked with the county since 2007. And what that means is we are, our role is to provide independent analysis and advice with respect to the planning and execution of public finance matters, of bonding. And remember, bonding is just a fancy term for borrowing money, basically. And our little niche of the world back in the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill became regulated. And so we are registered and regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the MSRB. But we do not commit our own capital. We're not a broker dealer. We are strictly an advisor. In a sense, we sit on your side of the table, and our job is to protect your interests throughout the planning and execution of bonds. And we have a fiduciary duty under the law now, which means, of course, we have to put our clients' interests ahead of our own. So the idea is to give you unvarnished advice and recommendations, and then hopefully to help you make good decisions when it comes to the issuance of debt. And, we're a fairly, large firm for a firm of our type. We have a staff of 17 all here in California. I work from the Bay Area. And I hope someday to come and meet, of course, with you in person. Okay, if there's no questions, we can move on to the overview of debt and the next slide. So what I've done here is just sort of highlighted there are four types of financings that are commonly used, especially by counties and cities, to fund capital improvements in new projects. And some of these you may be familiar with, and some you may not. The first is general obligation bonds. You may be familiar with those largely from school district financings and elections that you've had the opportunity to vote in yourself. But in a GO bond, those are secured by ad valorem property taxes. So the voters, typically a 2/3 vote, agree to impose on themselves an additional ad valorem property tax sufficient to make payments on a certain amount of bonding. So a school district, a county, a city might go out and say, hey, we'd like to raise, $50 million for this new project X. We're asking the voters to impose a tax on themselves. We can estimate what that tax would be based on the assessed value at the time of the issuance. But under all circumstances, the tax will be raised sufficient to pay the principal and interest on those bonds. And because that's such a highly secure bond, and from a credit point of view, those tend to be rated the highest, and as a result have the lowest interest rates. But of course, there's a high threshold were the county to pursue that, in that you would need to secure a 2/3 vote, which tends to be challenging for counties. We see it more common for school districts, though more recently I've seen your neighboring county, Santa Clara County, has had good success both for their health system, the VMC, and for their affordable housing program, and they did hit the 2/3 threshold there. Moving on to lease revenue bonds or certificates of participation. This is the instrument that we see most commonly used by counties to fund new projects, whether, as Ray said, it's a jail or a solar system or behavioral health or an admin building, because this does not require voter approval. And these tend to be, these would be secured by the general fund of the county. And I'm going to go into COPs a little deeper because that's the instrument I'm guessing you likely would use in the future. So in a couple of pages, we'll get there. But I just wanted to put that out. It's a form of lease financing, which means you would have an asset, county asset, that would be pledged. And in the event the county did not pay on its obligation, which of course we wouldn't expect would ever happen, but the bondholders then have a security interest in that asset and they could foreclose on that asset. A third type of financing that we see somewhat commonly in the county city space are revenue bonds. Typically, this would be secured by an enterprise fund. Counties really don't maintain as many enterprises as cities do. They don't typically do water or wastewater, but you do solid waste. That's one of the big utilities that counties, typically are responsible for. And so it's not uncommon for us to see the issuance of solid waste revenue bonds. And those would be bonds that would be secured solely by the net revenues of that particular enterprise. And in the case of solid waste, there would be tipping fee revenue that would come in. You would have various expenses. And so the net revenues after expenses and O&M would be what would secure those types of bonds. And those typically don't require voter approval, though under some limited circumstances they may. Finally, I just mentioned land secured finance. You may be familiar with that concept of Mello-Roos bonds or assessment district bonds. These are bonds secured by a special tax or an assessment that is approved by the property owners within a particular district. So the district could be countywide. It could be a subset of the county. Often we see this in connection with new, say, housing development, where a developer comes in, they have raw land, and they want to use tax-exempt financing to finance infrastructure like roads and sewers and lighting. So they create a district, either an assessment district or a community facilities district, and then the property owners need to vote a special assessment or tax in to secure a bond, which would finance that infrastructure. But CFDs and assessment districts can be used for other purposes as well, and we see it somewhat commonly, depending on sort of how real estate values are trending in the state. So these are four of the most common types of financing instruments used by counties. Yeah, moving on to the next slide. This is a snapshot of the debt that San Benito County has outstanding. You really do have a very low or moderate level of debt, which I think is prudent. And you have these three financings. One was what we call a direct purchase lease. That was the 2019 equipment lease for energy conservation improvements. And then you have these two certificate of participation financings, one for the adult detention facility and one for the behavioral health facility, all of which have been issued just in the last couple of years. And you can see the bars below show the debt service. The equipment lease would come due in 2039, and the others come due in 2049, 2050. We show here the original amount that was borrowed, and then on the table above, the amount that is still outstanding. Because it's only been a year or two, you haven't paid off a lot of that debt. But just like a home mortgage, these tend to be structured with level annual payments, where you pay off more interest in the early years and more principal in the later years, with the exception of the 2019 equipment lease, which has a slight ascending debt structure, where the annual debt service grows each year. And that was done in part to sort of lock in a certain amount of savings. These were solar projects and renewable energy projects, and that was intended to reflect how the electricity prices might have also grown with time had you not done the bond. Yeah, and then finally, over in the very far right-hand column, we have the ratings for each of these. Remember, ratings are assigned independently by a rating agency like Standard & Poor's or Moody's Investors Service. And your two public bonds here, the two COPs that achieved a rating that we sought a rating for, are both rated AA, which is very high because lease ratings generally are one notch lower than a GO bond rating would be. And so the implied GO bond rating for San Benito County, given this, would be a AA+, which is just one notch below the very highest rating one could achieve in the municipal market, and that's a AAA. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Just wait for you to move on. Yeah.
Don't move on, Gracie.
David? Can you hear us?
Oh, I'm sorry. Question. Yes. Go ahead. I apologize.
Can you go back to slide 3, please?
Yes.
I was waving the flags and, trying to get your attention. Just going for it. It's all good.
Apologies.
No, it's no worries. I just wanted to share with the board, when you look at this this particular slide, you'll actually see 4 topics here. And when you look at the voter approved, you see 2 of them, and you see 2 with no.
Yes.
The one thing I wanted to highlight for your board is you obviously are very familiar with the first one, dealing with the schools, especially with the school as of late, recently, the last 10 years. But down below, that one we actually work on, and you may not see that very often. I just wanted to share that is a voter approved, but it's voter approved based on the development in that group, wherever that development's going to be at. And I just wanted to highlight that for you. Normally, that starts off in the very beginning of the project, or that's when the beginning stages of moving forward with the project. So there is a vote, and it's voted on by the developer or whoever's moving that project forward. Most likely, it obviously depends, but and most likely it's going to be approved.
That's where CSAs come in, assessments, or is that different?
Well, CSAs, I'm not sure, David. Can you comment on that? I know CFDs are. I know the Melrose is, the assessments.
Yeah, I mean, typically, a CSA, as I understand it, is a variation of this. And so usually it's a service area. And you might, we see some counties that do have service areas for wastewater or water enterprises, like San Joaquin County does, I know, whereas many other counties don't, and those services are provided either by the cities or by an independent district, say a sanitation district or a water agency that's countywide. But CSAs can adopt land secured taxes that would be voted on by the property owners. And this typically for a county would be in the unincorporated. And they could support capital improvements, yeah, or even possibly operations for a CSA. I don't know, Ray, though, that San Benito County has community service agencies, do they? I'm not sure.
Yeah, we have quite a few of them. That's why the question is
Okay,
asked.
okay.
And we
Apologies.
do, and
Yeah.
it is exactly the same.
Okay.
With regards to that, so if they needed to assess like Stonegate as an example, they need to address their well, and it needs to increase, and there's not enough funding coming in. There could be a reassessment, but that assessment, and that's why I wanted to go to that slide, that assessment, that vote doesn't occur countywide. It occurs just in that area. So I just wanted to highlight that for your board.
Correct.
All right, thank you.
Correct. And sometimes we see, service overlapping functions provided by a CSA, like they may provide water and sewer, say, or well maintenance. And if bonds are issued, one would need to be careful to secure those bonds only by the particular enterprise that's being bonded for. So typically you can, secure the bond to fund a sewer system, with the revenue from the water enterprise. And that runs into some legal, challenges. But good point, Ray, that those, while voter approved, are approved usually just by the voters or property owners within within the subset of whatever represents that district, which is not typically countywide. And let me just make one other point about bonding, since we're sort of on the topic, and that is that local governments and governments in California and nationally under the federal tax code have the ability to borrow on what we call a tax exempt basis. And what that means is when you issue a bond for an approved purpose, typically capital, you get to issue a bond that is tax exempt to the investor. So in a bond, the investor is lending you money. You're the borrower, they're the lender. And they don't have to pay income tax on the interest that is paid to them by you. So as a result of the fact that the investor can lend money tax-free, they don't have to pay income tax, they're willing to lend to you at a lower rate than they would if they were paying income taxes. So that's a preference that local government has over, say, a corporation that would issue bonds in the taxable market typically. And this comes up, every 4 years or so at Congress. Whenever the tax code is being tinkered with, there's always a discussion of, the government's trying to raise more revenue and close tax loopholes. Should they shut down tax exemption for local governments? And it's a common discussion. They have not, typically that has not happened for the most part. They have sort of nibbled away at the edges and limited the universe of purposes for which local government can issue bonds on a tax exempt basis, but they haven't, eliminated that preference on some sort of wholesale basis. And we can talk about interest rates at some point, but I'm sure everybody's aware interest rates are super low right now. And so we're finding that local governments that do have needs or anticipated capital needs are finding this to be a favorable time to go ahead and bond just because the borrowing rates are so low. Okay. Any other questions at this point?
Just to add, and I think I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again since we're on the topic. The behavioral health building, I believe, was 2.47%.
Right.
Which was
For like
pretty-
30 years, for 30-year borrowing, I think.
Yeah, which was pretty amazing. It's
Yeah.
a great rate, and a big part
Yeah,
of
and
it has. Go ahead, David.
No, you go ahead. You go
I
ahead.
was just going to say a great part of it has to do with quite a few things, quite a few elements. But the AA rating was a big deal on the COP side, as well as some of the other things that we had going for us. But we were David had showed me a kind of a snapshot of who was borrowing, who's going out and borrowing and actually getting funded, and we were one of the top agencies that we had a really, that's why we had such a great rate, because we were sought after for that particular CLP. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, it's exactly right, Ray. And we're going to talk at the end of this presentation about your rating a little bit further and what goes into that, and why the market views you guys as such a favorable credit. And it has to do a lot with financial management, obviously, driven ultimately by the board and staff. Okay. On the next page, I just wanted to take a slightly deeper dive into this one instrument that is most commonly used, to fund capital projects by counties. And we call it a certificate of participation. And it's a form of lease finance. And without getting too far into the weeds, there is in the state of California, Article 16 of the Constitution, which is what we call the state constitutional debt limit. And it says, basically, you need a 2/3 vote of the people to issue what we traditionally call debt. And that's the general obligation bond that I think we're all most familiar with, and that requires a 2/3 vote. Then there are a variety of exceptions to that under which debt can be issued in the state without a vote and without a 2/3 vote. And certificates of participation or lease revenue bonds, they're sort of one and the same, fall under the contingent obligation exception to the voter approval requirement. So the reason that one doesn't need a vote for a certificate of participation is because these really are contingent obligations. And by that, I mean the county is entering into a lease for real property. And if it has use and occupancy of that piece of real property, then it will be obligated to make its lease payment or its debt service payment. But that's slightly different than a general obligation bond, say, which is true indebtedness, where the board is committing to make that debt service payment under any circumstance. Here, it's more of a contingent obligation. If the county has met these, if the conditions have been met, the county can be obligated to make a lease payment. But if they haven't been met, the county wouldn't be obligated to make its debt payment. And so a certificate of participation, while it doesn't require voter approval, is probably viewed a little bit less favorably in the market than a general obligation bond. And you might see a slightly higher interest rate and a lower rating, but not wildly so. And so you see on this page, the key features I mentioned here. First is this idea that it is a contingent obligation. Second, that it is a general fund credit. There is no new revenue being generated as there is with a GO bond when you have an ad valorem property tax. So there's no new revenue. It simply has to be fit within the priorities of the county's general fund budget. A third key distinguishing sort of factor or element in a COP is the idea that there is a piece of real property, and that's the lease element. So the county may have an existing piece of property that has no liens on it, say your admin facility, if it were a little newer. And what you would do is enter into this legal structure where you would lease it. You would lease it over to a nonprofit dominated by the county, and then the nonprofit would lease it back to you. It's a lease-back transaction, and then you would make these lease payments that would be certificated out to the bondholders. But the real key point here is that you need a piece of real property to finance, to use a COP. And that piece of real property could be the new project that you're financing. So in the case of the behavioral health facility, that could serve as the leased asset, or it could be an existing piece of real property that the county already has outstanding. What investors are going to look at is a couple of things. One, they're going to look at the essentiality of that piece of real property. So they're going to like an admin center facility or a jail a lot more than they're going to like a golf course. And those are sort of two extremes on the essentiality. And the thinking is you might be more inclined to walk away from the debt obligation if the piece of real property is less essential, the piece of real property that would be foreclosed upon. So that's one key issue, is essentiality. Two is the remaining useful life. The useful life has to, generally be coterminous, at least with the remaining life of the bonds. So if we're trying to do a COP today, and you're saying to me, "Hey, David, I'd really love to pledge this 50-year-old asset," that probably isn't going to fly unless that 50-year-old asset has been renovated and upgraded subsequently. And then finally, investors are going to look at the value of that real property and want to make sure if you're issuing $10 million of bonds, that the real property has, at least $10 million in value. And how we derive that value is a further discussion, but insured value, appraisals, discounted cash flow, lots of ways to look at value. So those are the kind of key elements of the pledged asset. And then the final, couple of points here have to do with some elements of a COP that are unique, and that is when we refer to an abatement means an event which makes the asset unavailable, that you can't occupy it any longer. So you pledge this asset, 5 years from now, there's a big fire. Fire burns the building, you can't occupy the building. Remember, the contingent obligation means if you don't have use in an occupancy, legally, under the debt limit, you can't be obligated to make a lease payment. So what happens is the investors say, okay, I realize that's a risk. I want you to be sure that you have property and casualty insurance so that you can rebuild that building and start making lease payments again. And I want you to have this other insurance, rental interruption insurance, which ensures that for 2 years, you've got a policy there to make debt payments while you're rebuilding that asset. So these are some of the ways we try and address the risks attendant to a contingent obligation. And then finally, generally, COPs are structured with a level debt service, maybe slightly ascending, like in the case of your solar deal. So I think I'll just stop there, Ray, and see if you had any questions or comments before I move on.
I'll pass it to the board. I don't have any.
Any questions for Amy?
I'll wait till the end. Thank you.
Okay, yes.
Go ahead, David. Continue.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So let's move on and talk a little bit about sales tax. And I'm sure everybody's aware of that there are statewide sales taxes and then there are locally imposed sales tax. We all pay the statewide sales tax regardless of where we live. And then we all may pay different levels of sales tax depending on not just where we live, but where we make purchases, of course. So the sales and use tax is divided among the state and local governments. The total base tax is 7.25%. That's sort of the state base. And then under various ordinances, local governments are allowed to add up to 2% in supplementary local sales taxes. Cities, counties, special districts can adopt additional taxes not to exceed 2% unless they receive some special legislation that would allow them to go above the 2%. So that would require state legislative action, and we have seen that in some cases. But I think absent that, we're working with 2% supplementary local sales taxes that could be added by cities, counties, and special districts. We're going to get into in a minute the different kinds of sales taxes. There's a general tax and there's a special tax, and those have different voter approval requirements. But for now, let's just sort of look, regardless of whether it's general or special, at the capacity for additional taxes. And that's what this table is trying to show. We've got the city of Hollister here, and they've got, everybody's got the 7.25% base tax, San Juan Bautista and the unincorporated. And then we look at the supplementary tax. Measure G, which was a special tax adopted by the COG, or now the Transportation Authority, is part of the supplementary tax. So that has, a 1% additional sales tax for special purposes, transportation purposes. Now, keep in mind that while that tax is levied and goes to the COG, the original ordinance and the expenditure plan that was adopted and approved by the voters involves a return of some of that money to each of the three entities, the two cities and the county. So that's just the way the expenditure plan was set up. Some of the money was is allocated for, Highway 25 and what I would call regional projects. And then other of the money is to be returned for local road projects to each of the jurisdictions. But nonetheless, that's a 1% of a supplementary tax that's in place now. So then we say, okay, so how much additional capacity is there? Well, we see that the city of Hollister has also adopted a 1 cent or 1% local, sales tax. So they're maxed out at the 9.25. San Juan Bautista has a 3/4 cent tax, so they still have room for another sort of 1/4 cent, and the county has room for an additional full cent because you have no local tax. And I think that's where this conversation is started from, right, Ray? The idea that, hey, maybe we should look at bringing the county, and by that I mean the unincorporated area of the county, up to the same level that the cities are at, so that they're, regardless of where you would buy a product, you'd be paying the same tax, and then the county would benefit from that revenue the way the cities are benefiting from their local taxes. And Ray, is that a fair context for why this discussion is happening?
Yeah, so I just a little background on this. I know the administration over the years, over the last 10 years, has brought this back to the board because it has, as that diagram indicates, we're completely off. We're off by 1% or 1 cent here.
Yep.
And unfortunately, we did not move forward with it. But I wanted to share with you, David, as well as the public, the ad hoc made up of Supervisor Kosmicki and Supervisor Tiffany. We've been looking at avenues and ways to increase revenues in our county. And so this item did come up, and the ad hoc wanted to bring it back. Really, this item is spurred on from the ad hoc, and they can talk a little bit more after the presentation. But yes, you are correct, David. This is something that we want to look at and potentially move forward with, so we could receive some revenue.
Makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. And a few slides beyond, I have some, common. I have a list of some of the common revenue generating tools that counties have available at their disposal to, generate additional revenue, and sales taxes are certainly one of them. And you would not be alone if you were to pursue a general sales tax, which would be available for, operating purposes. You could use it for capital, but you also could use it for operating purposes. So let's continue the conversation on the next slide. And this dives in a little bit into some of the statutory language which pertains to transaction and use tax measures, which is a little bit different than some of the other general taxes, like a TOT or a business tax, which might have a different mechanism for approval. And so what these sections seem to say is that, the first says that the board of any county may levy a transactions and use tax throughout the entire county or within the unincorporated area of the county, if the tax is approved by the majority of the qualified voters of the entire county, if levied on the entire county, or the unincorporated area of the county, if levied on just the unincorporated area of the county. The revenues derived from the tax may only be used for general purposes within the area for which the tax was approved. So this section of the Revenue and Taxation Code, 7285, deals with general taxes. 7285.5 below deals with special taxes. And there it says that you need a 2/3 vote, whereas up above for the general tax, you need only a majority vote. And that's the distinction between these two code sections. And then finally, 7251.1, we just highlight, says the combined tax rate for all supplemental local tax rates may not exceed 2%. We've already talked about that, but this is where that derives from. And so the question, the question that's relevant for us under 7285 is, does this mean that we are limited if we want to impose a tax just in the unincorporated area, which is really all we can do because Hollister is already maxed out, so we couldn't really do a countywide tax without getting special legislative authority. So in order to just proceed with an unincorporated area tax, this makes it sound like we need to have a vote of just the voters in the unincorporated area, that we couldn't do a countywide vote including voters in the cities, to impose a tax that is just in the unincorporated area. And I'm making a big deal out of this because, as Ray knows and Joe Paul and others, that's not necessarily the case with certain other general taxes. And Ray, I know you've mentioned that a miner's tax, I guess, was adopted where it was imposed just in the unincorporated area, but there was a countywide vote. And so I think this is an area that, we would want county council to opine on and dig a little deeper. I know I saw some email traffic from county council previously, which I think is consistent with what we're presenting here. But that would inform what the nature of the vote will be. And then you have to evaluate politically what are the likelihood of success given those restrictions. If you just have voters in the unincorporated area, how likely will they be, even at the 50% threshold, to support an additional tax? And obviously, you can hire an election polling company, which is very common in this, and they can do some very preliminary polling for not too much money, and they will ask the question a certain way. Would you support a tax if if the intent is to spend the money on this, and that? And they, are usually pretty accurate in evaluating the likelihood of success. I don't know, Ray, if you want to weigh in further at this point on this slide.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Yes, I know Barbara and I have worked on this, and Barbara has come up with some analysis. So I'll go ahead and defer to her for a legal basis.
Yes, we were recommending that the county receive guidance from the board about what type of ordinance it would like to propose, what type of tax it'd be interested in. And we're on the opinion that the county could further explore a countywide tax following the model of Los Angeles County, because you can impose, Los Angeles did impose a countywide tax, even though some other cities were maxed out. And it would be contingent upon the setting forth our proposed ordinance, sending it to the California Department of Tax Fee Administration, and receiving their review of it. So that would be our recommendation, to run it by them to see whether they approve of that structure in our county.
So,
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? That's helpful. When you say, so you're saying a countywide tax, would that be a tax that is imposed countywide or just voted on countywide?
Imposed countywide.
Okay, great.
We'll have further communications with the Department of Tax Fee Administration, depending on where the county wants to go with this.
And it would be voted on countywide for,
Yes.
in essence, for the unincorporated area, because they're already tapped out in the city of Hollister. So,
But that's in spite of what we're reading here, which would seem to indicate that's not allowed, but you're saying legally it's been done. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, Los Angeles does have something similar. I mean, like that.
I see. So it's a countywide tax, but if you're tapped out, you don't get any of it. Is that the
Because some of
idea?
the larger jurisdictions, like let's talk Riverside, Orange County, et cetera, there's many jurisdictions where they cannot, they want to do a countywide tax, but they can't take into account each individual city. So they still do a countywide tax. So if the board, if that's the first choice of the board, then we will delve into it just to confirm that that's the possibility. So I don't want you to eliminate that possibility at this time.
See. So maybe it's specified in the language of what's on the ballot, for example, or those are things.
I know that it's an impartial analysis. I assume it's actually in the ordinance itself states that it's, there was a section in the impartial analysis that would indicate that it's not, it's imposed countywide, but but not above that dollar, that percentage, the top percentage.
See.
And I can.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's interesting. It makes sense to me in a way. I mean, that if you're imposing a countywide tax, that doesn't run counter to 7285. You're going to get a majority of the countywide voters. And then it's just that tax can't, under 7251 can't exceed 2% in every jurisdiction. And so it's an interesting idea to do a countywide tax. I guess San Juan Bautista would get 1/4 cent of it, right? They have the capacity to benefit from some. and then the unincorporated would benefit for the rest.
But we do have to rule out, that they had, what we do have to make sure is that there's no special legislation that they have and, all these details. But we were asking the board to still consider that as an option. And then we have not contacted the Department of Fee Tax Administration. The CAO's office is going to do that after we prepare the draft ordinance. We already have a draft ordinance started. After we receive direction, that will be finalized, and then we will run it by the Department of Tax Fee and Administration to get their feedback. They have a legal department as well. I
So-
understand. I
so
haven't talked to them.
We'll wait once we can get to the end of this presentation, deliberate, and get some feedback from your board, direction from your board on that.
Okay.
So if you want to continue, David?
Yeah, that's great. Any other questions on this page? I mean, obviously, I think everybody appreciates the difference between a general tax and a special tax. Obviously, a 50% threshold is easier to achieve, but the voters are then entrusting the board to spend the money on really any purpose it wants to spend it on. So you might communicate in your educational materials that you intend to spend it on X, Y, and Z, but legally you'd be free to spend it on any sort of other approved purpose. Any purpose that the county spends money on. Okay. Let's go on real quickly. I think we can move through these pretty quickly. So we've sort of already talked about the 1% and the statutory limit.
There's some projections here from HDL, so I want to thank staff for reaching out to them on what they would generate for the unincorporated area in the county, which is about $3.34 million on that 1%. So, and a big part of that, there's a lot happening with the acquiring of items through online services. So that has increased. We had a quote some time back at the last time we brought this to the board, and it was about a little bit over $2 million. So it's increased significantly, and a big part of that is because of that. So, sorry, David.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's great. I got muted somehow. I apologize, but that's exactly right. And it's a healthy amount of money that can be generated, as you can see. The next few bullets, just a reminder that a general tax requires a majority vote, and whereas a special tax requires a 2/3 vote. And if the county were to want to bond against the tax revenue, and I'm not saying that you would, but the form of bonding that you would use is for a majority vote tax is a general fund back tax, because that revenue is really just additional revenue of the county that could be used for any purpose. So we come back to that certificate of participation as the principal instrument that would be used. The way we would protect the general fund, in a sense, would be to size the bonds carefully so that the debt service doesn't exceed the amount of sales tax revenue that you anticipate collecting. But ultimately, the bondholders would look to the general fund, not to the sales tax specifically, for repayment. Whereas when you do a special tax, if you were to get a 2/3 vote, the way that the COG did, then you can issue revenue bonds that are secured solely by that tax. But that's really a feature unique to the special tax. And so on the next slide, if we can go there, we have just done, for illustration purposes, a couple of bonding scenarios. And again, I have no idea how you would want to spend the money from the sales tax, whether it's a mix of capital and operations or strictly non-capital. But for you to see what your bonding capacity would be, we have run two scenarios. One, assuming that you sort of bond against 100% of that $3 million a year, whatever the sales tax receipts were likely to be. So all of those dollars are used to pay annual debt service on the bonds. And you could see under the uses column, we generate about $52.6 million for projects. And again, because these are tax exempt bonds, these would need to be used for capital purposes, and the proceeds, there's other tax limits. We generally have to spend the money that you receive from a bond within 3 years. So you wouldn't bond today for a project you're going to build in 10 years. And then we've run a 50% scenario, not surprisingly, that generates about $26 million in project fund proceeds, using a variety of assumptions about where interest rates are, et cetera. But keep in mind, if you're only bonding against half of it, then half of the revenue is available for other purposes. And so at the very last line of the little blue chart says, what's left over after you pay debt service? And we show 14 million for the first scenario because over time it's assumed that there will be some growth in the sales tax. So while every dollar of the sales tax is going to be used to pay debt service on day one, in year one, over time, and we've assumed a very conservative 2% growth in the sales tax. So that generates 14 million over the 20 years of additional revenue on top of the bonding. And then in scenario B, you would have closer to 47.8 or 48 million in additional revenue. And that, again, assumes 2% growth per year. So this is just a very preliminary bonding analysis. We tried to be somewhat conservative in the interest rates that we used. We added 0.5% to sort of the current market. Obviously, it will ultimately depend on market conditions, when you issue the bonds. Ray, any comments or questions on this?
No, I have none. Thanks, David.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So the last slide on this section is this slide about some of the common revenue generating strategies that we see, used by counties and cities. And this is by no means a complete list or intended to be an exhaustive list. But each of these would have different voter approval requirements, can be levied in different ways, whether it's countywide or unincorporated, and would, if bonded against, utilize a different financing mechanism. The first one, the ad valorem property tax we talked about, that you can only do to support bonds, right? You can't just go out and raise property taxes for operating purposes. You can do this to support general obligation bonds. And again, those bonds under the state constitution would have to be used for the purpose of acquiring or improving real property. So it has to be some land, some building, or some kind of real property related purpose. And then we move into the realm of these general taxes. We've talked about a general sales tax that would require a majority vote. There's business license taxes, right? And I think that a cannabis tax, that you've already taken advantage of, would fall within that. And that has its own sort of voter approval requirement. I assume it's 50%, but not an expert on that. And hotel taxes as well, transit occupancy taxes. And this is, Ray, where I think sometimes you're allowed to impose a tax locally on the unincorporated, but have a countywide vote because these are under different statutory authorities. Then we get into the realm of special taxes, where you couldn't just use the revenue for any purpose, and that's like the transportation tax. And that there is the special sales tax, that's a 2/3 vote. And then there's parcel taxes, which is another vehicle. I think they're considered special taxes. They could be generally, I think it could be countywide or local, and that's a levy on parcels, on real property, typically set at some sort of fixed dollar amount per parcel rather than based on assessed value. So you just, X number of parcels, total dollars you're trying to generate, fee per parcel. And I think that's a 2/3 vote generally as well. Benefit assessments, we've talked a little bit about that. That's what Ray was talking about, maybe on a land secured with new development, where a developer is going to build houses out on a piece of new land and or use mellow roofs or benefit assessments. And they're kind of their own beast in my view. That's why I've separated them out. And they typically require a 50% vote of the property owners within the district. And when there's new development, typically that's just one property owner, the developer. And then they build a bunch of units of housing, and then they pass along the Mello-Roos special tax or the assessment, through to the new property owners as folks buy the houses. And then finally, there are all sorts of user fees, I assume, developer impact fees. I believe the county has already, has some in place. Utility fees, again, I don't think County of San Benito runs a lot of utilities, but solid waste perhaps is the exception. So these are some of the revenue generating strategies that we see widely used. Any comments or questions on this?
No, go ahead, Dave. Keep going.
Great. Okay, we're almost done. I know I want to run through this somewhat quickly here. So the whole next section is about debt affordability and rating agency metrics. And I'm not going to dive too deeply, but I think this slide is interesting on page 13. The second row basically adds up to 100%. And it's the way that Standard & Poor's, one of the rating agencies, looks at local government credits. And they have these, 5 buckets. Ignore the institutional framework. That's the same for every county. The economy sort of is 30% of your weighting. And there's really very little that you as a board can do to, change the macro economy quickly, at least in San Benito County. It's not one that you have a lot of control over. I mean, you're going to do economic development for sure. It's important. But the economy is what it is when the rating agency looks at it. But the ones that you do have control over are these other 3 buckets. Management scoring, 20%. And there's a lot in there, and Ray knows when we go to the rating agency, we talk a lot about it, but it has to do with things like doing a mid-year budget analysis and making adjustments mid-year, doing multi-year revenue forecasting, having a debt policy, having a reserve policy, having a CIP that is at least 5 years out and is updated, periodically. So there's sort of a list of 7 things, that they look at, all of which I think are important and which your county does a good job of. Otherwise, you wouldn't be getting a AA rating, as Ray says. And they're important things. And we think they're important anyway, regardless of the rating, but it's validated through the strength of your rating. And if you were to deviate from those, potentially that would be reflected in a downgrade in your rating. The other measures that are important are financial and debt. And the financial is broken into 3 sub-buckets. One is your cash, or your liquidity. One is your budgetary performance, which means how your revenues and expenditures balance out each year. At the end of the year, were you conservative when you did your budget so that revenues end up exceeding your expenditures? Or were you less than conservative and it turns out that maybe you ran a structural deficit in your budget? That's what budgetary performance is. And then finally, budgetary flexibility really reflects your fund balances and your reserves. How much financial flexibility do you have to weather the storm when revenues decline or expenditures increase, and as they inevitably do during recessionary, periods. And that's what they're looking at there. And they have metrics for all this stuff. There's ratios, and we calculate all these ratios, and that's how they score you. And then finally is your debt level and debt and contingent liability. And I just think it's interesting because a lot of clients or issuers will think, well, if I have low debt, I'll automatically get a great rating. And if I have a lot of debt, I'm going to get a low rating. And that's just not true. Debt and contingent liability is only 10% of the overall rating, if you will. And that's not to suggest that one should go crazy and issue a lot of debt. It's just to say that debt is viewed by the rating agency in the context of other financial and management issues. So let's just carry on to the next slide. I don't want to spend much time on all this. I just want you to see that what S&P does is they have all these ratios and they rate you from 1 to 5. And then they drop it into those weightings, those buckets on the right, the criteria category, and then the arrow down below, they spit out a numerical score that accompanies different levels of ratings. And look, it looks a lot more like science than it really is. There's still some subjective factors at play here, but they're trying to make it more transparent. And then on the next page, 15, I just mentioned that, in fact, there are different qualitative adjustments that they're free to make that can move ratings up or down, which is why it's so important when we solicit a rating for a bond issue that we go and meet with them in person. Ray has done this with his staff many times now, twice, and tell the story. Let them know about how you are approaching your budget, economic development, management, fund balance, all of these things. Moving on to the next page, again, we're almost done here. We've developed something called a debt affordability model. It's basically a glorified spreadsheet, and that tracks the ratios that S&P uses to calculate your budgetary performance and flexibility and liquidity and debt scores. And so you could say, hey, we want to consider a new $30 million bond deal for X, Y, and Z. We can drop it into our model and forecast out the debt service for that new issue and see what sort of impact it would have on your ratios and on your rating. And it's not to say that you should make your decisions based solely on whether it would impact your rating or not, but it's a nice frame of reference to see what the impact of new debt is on your overall financial metrics. And that's one way to evaluate your capacity. And I can tell you now that you have, a relatively low debt load. So you have capacity for additional debt. Again, it doesn't mean you should issue it. You need to use it wisely. And ultimately, it involves budgetary trade-offs. But if the need were there, the market would show up because you're viewed as a very highly, a high credit-worthy entity. And so you would have market access. And then on the next few slides, let's just go to the next slide, budgetary performance. This is where we actually do all your scoring and your budgetary flexibility. We score you a 1 on the S&P criteria. Your budgetary performance, we score you a 2, which is also a 1 or a 2, very high. Going to the next slide, liquidity is your cash score using their criteria, a 1, very high. Finally, debt and contingent liabilities. We based on the table on the right, they have two. I'll spend a little more time here. There's 2 debt ratios that S&P looks at. One is your net direct debt as a percentage of total governmental fund revenue, and if it's less than 30%, you score a 1. And then on the left, it's your annual debt service as a percentage of expenditures. So the top ratio is your total par amount that you've issued as a percentage of 1 year's revenue. It's like a burden. And the other is your debt service. It's kind of more of a budget concept. And if it's under 8%, you would score a 1. And basically, you can look over on the left, but your annual debt service is 0.8%. So it's not even 1%. So you could go all the way up to 8% and still have a 1 scoring. And your net direct debt is a 23%, and well below the 30%, and certainly below the 60% that would score you a 1 or a 2, which are both very high scorings. The last slide that I'll mention is here, the next page. And when we look at debt and contingent liability, there are these qualitative factors that come into play as well. So there's the scoring of those ratios, and then they have a bunch of qualitative factors. And I've pulled out one of them because I just think it's important for the board to keep this in the back of your mind, and that has to do with unaddressed exposure to large unfunded pension and OPEB obligations. And so if they view that you have a large unfunded pension and OPEB, they can adjust this 10% bucket down perhaps, or to adjust for what they view as an elevated liability. And the following areas down below, the second bullet, are assessed to measure this burden. If you have a combined annual cost for pension and OPEB that is in excess of 10% of expenditures, then that's considered elevated. If your actuarial funded ratio is less than 80%, which, by the way, most counties are less than 80%, that's considered elevated. If an actual contribution made is less than the fully required contribution. So if you're not paying your annual required contribution, your ARC, that would be a concern. And then finally, OPEB costs in particular, and that's, retiree health, that exceed 5%, just for the subset of OPEB of total governmental fund expenditures, that's considered elevated. And so when we do our debt affordability model and we have this big spreadsheet, we have all these numbers in there as well to kind of keep an eye on. But pension is, of course, one of the biggest areas of concern for local governments generally across the country, and even in California. We have PEPRA now, which is helping with what I would call the normal cost as more and more employees, new employees come in and are subject to PEPRA and in new levels, new layers. That's helping in the long term. But the unfunded liability exists, and that's already on the books, and that's something the county is going to have to manage. So Ray, I'm going to stop now and turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. I appreciate it. And one of the things I just wanted to highlight with that, I do know that the county's been actively addressing OPEB and our pension. We've done a really good job. I think that's one of the factors why we did fairly well with our rating. And we'll continue to look at it. We'll continue to give you reports as we do every year, especially during our budget process. So with that, I'm going to pass this on to our ad hoc, Supervisor Kosmicki and Supervisor Tiffany, and let them talk to this item, because this item really came from the ad hoc.
Go ahead, Colin.
Madam Chair? Yes. Thank you. So we recommended bringing this forward. Just real quick, a few things. Personally, I would support doing the countywide model, so that we can ask the voters throughout the county, because everybody in the county shops locally, including the unincorporated area. So I certainly think that's appropriate. And then the logic behind it, like was mentioned, there's no reason to not match our neighboring jurisdictions here in our community, Hollister in particular. There's no reason it should be lower in unincorporated. It creates, a competitive advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you look at it. The raising of the $3.34 million just at the outset, I think is a big deal. We're sitting here working on economic development, so I think we all expect that number to, cross our fingers, go up over time significantly. But also just, I thought the factor of the going from 2 million to 3.34 with online, the pandemic, I'm sure, has played somewhat of a role in that. But I'm a believer that shift in our the way we shop is permanent. And I don't expect to not have Amazon packages showing up on my porch almost every day anytime soon. So I think that's a big deal. We obviously know there's a need for more revenue. We talk about roads and services and operations, and just broadly, I think the public shares that concern about all these things we're trying to improve here. So really, it would be up to them. If they want to, we're not approving a tax if we put it on the ballot. We're letting the voters decide. And I think that's another big factor. As far as just the sales tax part, I think it probably should have been done years ago, but that's all hindsight. It doesn't mean we should leave it at the 0, or I guess it's 1% with Measure G forever. I do think that now would be the right time to consider a sales tax. And then as far as the bonding, it's very interesting portion of the presentation. I thought interest rates, we all know, are very, very low, historically low right now. So if we are going to do additional bonding, I think it's sooner the better. The market turns at any point, and we may be regretting that we didn't do it. So I think looking at the COP option makes a lot of sense. We've been talking about a lot of different facilities here that we need to either renovate or replace. The library comes to mind. There could be a really big opportunity, the library and maybe a couple of the other key facilities that we've discussed. Maybe there's even some room to, if we do a bond, the sales tax revenue, I don't think would necessarily have to go all toward bonding. I think you could split it up, and maybe we bond for, I don't know what the number is. That would be something we would have to discuss going forward, but maybe we bond for half of the 50-something million or 2/3 of it, I think we've talked about a library that we could do at the current location, for instance, at I think a much lower cost than some of the numbers that were originally thrown out, the 40 million, 50 million, 60. I don't think that's realistic. I think a new library would have to be somewhat modest in nature. The $10 million or so or under or around that range seems to make more sense to me. So those are just my general thoughts. I support putting the sales tax on the ballot. I support looking at COP options as well. Thank you.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. Basically, go along with everything that Supervisor Kuzmicki said. Yeah, I think the bonding is an interesting part of this presentation. And I'm right in thinking, I mean, obviously, we could do bonding whether or not we pass the sales tax, although obviously passing the sales tax measure, if it did pass, gives us a lot more flexibility and ability to do that. But it is certainly, as Supervisor Kuzmicki points out, we are at historically low rates, and now would be the time to do it, for sure. It is unfortunate that the county didn't go along with the city back a few years ago, but we are where we are. I think it does make sense. The voters can make that decision. I think it needs to be a countywide. Hopefully we can get legal support that it can be countywide. And I think it makes sense. Frankly, I don't think most people really fully even appreciate that, it's 9.25 or it's 8.25. I think very few people even realize there's a difference. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that there is that difference as far as I'm concerned. But the voters can make that decision. And also, I think we're reminded that, and that's why we're looking at revenue generation. We are generally a poor county. I mean, we're getting 11 cents on the dollar property tax. We have very limited ways to generate revenue. This is certainly one of them, and certainly the constituents want to have better services. They do want to have better roads, a better library, any number of things, and this certainly makes sense for us to look at. So I would be fully in support of us going forward with this as well, although we do need to see what the legal analysis is of this going forward. Thank you.
The aspect that I like about it's going to go ahead and go to the voters, so that even though it's an idea that originated here, but at least the voters get to have that say. I know right now finances are difficult for a lot of people community-wide with the pandemic and employment issues being difficult for some people, but it is going to go to the voters, and so I can get behind this as long as everybody has the opportunity to have their say. Yeah, so I'm very much for this at this level. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you, David. I want to thank Gracie as well. She did a lot of work on this. With that being said, Madam Chair, we'll go ahead and defer it to you for opening up for questions for the public. But I think, yeah.
Okay, so it looks like there's not anybody from the public in the chamber, so go ahead and go to Zoom and see if there are any questions. Thank you.
If you'd like to make a comment on Zoom, please press *9 on your phone or the raise your hand icon on your screen. No comments on Zoom.
So, Madam Chair, we got direction from your board. We'll move forward. We'll go ahead and work with legal and go ahead and move forward with this, and we'll keep providing updates to your board on the status.
But if I could possibly get further direction, it's not a final answer on these issues right now, but when we're preparing a draft ordinance to come back for your board and we're running it by the state, I mean, we're confirming that we do want a 1% countywide general tax, not a special tax, and the duration of the tax. Have you had any contemplation on 20 years, 30 years, 15 years, 5 years? You don't have to come to a final answer of that right now.
We can come when we have it developed. You guys can think about it and get back to us.
Yeah, I'd personally like to see some different alternatives and give us an idea of how much money it would generate, and then we'd have to look at where we would spend that money, and we want to be fiscally responsible with the approach.
Right.
Definitely.
And do you want to talk about polling at all? Polling?
What we're going to do is we're going to work on it. We're going to see if it works. I would recommend we can come back and then provide kind of what we actually have got back from, the powers to be on moving forward with a countywide tax. And then after that, I think we'll go through some of these details with you. We have plenty of time, so we're way ahead of the game right now. And we'll come back to you probably in a couple months, 3 months maybe, 2 months, with a little bit more details. But I think we got a gist. Definitely countywide, definitely the full percent. We'll come back with some options on the 20-year,
No,
30-year.
please go ahead.
Yeah, excuse me, and I know we do have time. We're talking about next year's election. But when, do you know when, I guess we can talk to Joe Paul, but at what point do we really drop dead date as far
I
as?
believe it's August, late July,
Gracie,
August.
do you have the dates? You want to? Joe Paul, are you on the line? Can you answer that?
Yes, I am.
Can you answer the question, Joe Paul?
Yes. So the drop dead date would be 88 days before the election that you choose to have it on. So it could be the June primary election, which would be, let's see, March. And I think March 12th. I'm looking at it right now.
2022.
Okay.
And then the November election, same thing.
Yes, basically, it follows that same, the same 88-day rule for any agency to bring forward a resolution to, put a measure like this on the ballot.
Thank you, Joe Paul.
So basically, in March for the June election, if you wanted to go that early.
So we have plenty of time.
Sure.
Yeah.
And one follow-up, or a separate question. As part of the analysis, can we take a look also at potential bonding separate from the sales tax?
Just separately,
Yeah, I'm just curious to see, how, that doesn't help us in terms of revenue, but in terms of getting certain things done, if we take that approach as opposed to,
yeah.
Through the sales tax,
Yeah.
just so we're looking at kind of all the options.
We'll look at bonding capacity. I know we did an analysis before. It's not current, so we'll come back. There's been some things that we've done, so we need to look at that number. But we'll come back to your board with the bonding capacity. We'll work with David on that.
Appreciate that as
Yeah.
well.
Okay. I think we got clear direction from your board.
Okay. So
Thank you,
if
Madam
there-
Chair.
If there aren't any further questions, then we'll go on to item 44.
We have our interim RMA director here, Mike Chambliss, and Selena.
Good afternoon, Sheriff. I did not say morning. So, item 44 will be a presentation on the, sorry. There we go. I'll start over. Item 44 will be a presentation on the Recycle Right program that the county and Recology are working in an effort to drive down the contamination of the garbage rates. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Selena, the Integrated Waste Manager, and I'm going to run outside and go get the representative from Recology.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, Chair Gonzalez and board. Joining me today, who's coming over shortly, is Shauna McCracken, the Recology Zero Waste Manager, to discuss ongoing Recycle Right education to our residents and businesses, and more specifically, educating on what is recyclable and the impacts of recycling contamination and wish cycling. A few definitions, what we mean when we say recycle right. We mean placing the correct recyclable items into the appropriate blue or green recyclables container, but also placing the non-recyclable items like paper, coffee cups, straws, chip bags into the garbage bin, the gray garbage bin. Recycling contamination, can we show perfect. Recycling contamination is any material placed in the blue or green bin that is not accepted in curbside recycling programs. As an example, while you might be able to drop off and recycle plastic bags at Safeway, Target, or another retailer, these items are not recycled through our curbside collection programs, and if placed in the green or blue bin, would be considered contamination. This is due to changing international markets and impacts of these flimsy plastics on recycling infrastructure. They get caught up in the sorting equipment and make recycling facilities less efficient. And then wish cycling. We've all done it, myself included. The act of not really knowing if an item should be placed in the blue bin or the green bin, maybe even doubtful, but wishing and hoping it were so, and placing it in the recycling bin anyways, hoping for the best. Well, instead of placing those non-recyclable items like plastic utensils through or straws in the recycling, if one is unsure if the item is recyclable, through this Recycle Right campaign and continued outreach, we are promoting and encouraging them to look up the item and use one of the many free resources we will share with you later in this presentation. And then when in doubt, throw it in the garbage. Throw it out. Here is an example of wish cycling in San Benito County. On the right is a recycle bin filled with carpet padding or some other type of floor layer, which is non-recyclable and actually belongs in the trash. On the left side is a residential organics cart overflowing with wooden chairs. These wooden chairs are considered bulky items and would be considered contaminated if placed in any bin. Recology does offer twice a year bulky item curbside collection for residents, or we offer a quarterly free bulky item collection for residents at John Smith Road Landfill. Here is another example of a contaminated recycling bin. This one contains diapers, soiled papers, and what you can't see is there was also automotive waste and other hazardous waste. We know this because Shauna actually tagged it herself. So reducing contamination and education is an essential component of the Recology franchise agreement. As a way to mitigate contamination per the franchise agreement, Recology can issue contamination tags to any customer with a contaminated container. After 3 contamination tags, any customer that continues to have contamination levels greater than 10% by volume in their container can be issued a contamination fee per incident. During the first few years of the agreement, Recology and IWM have not pursued contamination checks nor issued any fees. However, due to the county's increasing contamination rate, we have needed to take necessary measures to better manage contamination. In 2019, our recycling, or the blue bin contamination alone, was 25%, and by 2020, it rose to 34%. These numbers are determined by a waste characterization study, which is performed each year in the fall by a third-party consulting firm contracted by the Monterey Regional Waste Management District. The consultant determines the study samples, including the routes. Once our recycling, or the blue bins, just the blue bins, not the green bins, are picked up by Recology, they are taken to the Marina Materials Recovery Facility for recycling processing. Unfortunately, anything above 10% contamination at the recycling facility, which is run by the Monterey Regional Waste Management District, does add additional cost to the recycling processing and disposal fees. This is one of the several contributing factors to our rate increases. But what is more than the processing cost is the disposal cost. Any recycling residuals or contamination are tons going to the landfill. The more tons of trash going to the landfill, the higher the disposal costs are. These costs are then passed on to their customers, which would be Recology, and then to Recology's customers, our residents and businesses. Aside from contamination increasing, another contributing factor to increased recycle right measures is due to changing international markets, recycling markets. Recently, international restrictions like China's national sword policy have resulted in global efforts to reduce recycling contamination. To summarize, the policy placed strict regulation on imports of solid waste and banned various imported recyclables, which was intended to improve environmental conditions and adopt higher recycling standards within China. Before the policy, China would import huge quantities of waste from countries such as the United States, and at that time there were fairly low standards for what would be accepted. So recyclable waste would often be mixed with trash, contaminated with items such as plastic containers with food debris, resulting in China processing facilities having to manage all that unusable waste. These new standards for cleaner recycling are impacting recycling efforts throughout the United States and require a renewed focus on how and what to recycle. We are following the practices of several other California cities and counties who are also now enforcing fines and increasing recycle right education. However, in our Recycle Right campaigning efforts, we do not intend to fine people unless absolutely necessary. This campaign is all about education. Education for Recycle Right, Keep It Clean, Better at the Bin has been ongoing since the start of the franchise agreement, but a more recent change included plastic bags and film no longer being accepted at the curb in the blue recycling bins. This includes any plastic bags, Ziploc bags, chip bags, candy wrappers, snack wrappers, bubble wrap, etc. Again, these changes are true for many across the United States, not just San Benito County. In fact, many other regions stopped accepting film plastic in their recycling programs even earlier than we did. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Shauna to share more on our local Recycling Right campaign efforts over the past few years. Thank you.
Thanks, Selena. Can we go on to the next slide?
Oh, yes.
Do you have the clicker? Okay, so this shows some of the elements of our Recycle Right campaign, which I believe began before I joined last spring, but has continued ever since. And so these are just a few of the elements. You can see in the upper right the blue ad that has appeared online, in newspapers, and so on. The film plastics belong in the trash, sort of banner-shaped graphic there is a truck sign that, and those have been on the trucks you've probably noticed for most of last year. And let's see, there's information on our website, again on social media, and a different version of the print and online ads are there in the lower right.
Yeah, and we also did a press release through Benito Link and the San Benito County Nixle sharing these changes to residents.
Yeah, and letting people know what the top contaminants were.
Yeah.
And more on that. So looking at the commercial loads, these tend to be the top contaminants. Again, plastic bags and films, pet food snack bags, styrofoam, personal protective equipment. Of course, last year there was a lot more of that. Unfortunately, a lot of it was littered, and then sometimes people were wish cycling that, putting it in the recycling. Cooking oil, grease, and fats is a problem. And soiled paper products are also a big problem. So that's the commercial loads. Residential doesn't look too different, although you see a few things like textiles, clothing being an issue, and also broken toys and ceramics. Again, a lot of wish cycling going on. People really, I always think it should be called hope cycling. They're really hoping that it's recyclable, but it's just not. All right, so moving on. This was a postcard mailed out last year to reinforce the rest of the campaign, get it in people's mailboxes and hopefully maybe on their refrigerators or something, at least shared with family members, to really underscore the importance of not putting film plastics in the trash or in the not putting them in the recycling and yes, putting them in the trash. Okay, and this was a postcard that went out very recently, as you probably know. It was sent around July 1st, I believe, because that's just before July 1st, since that's when it went into effect. And this just outlines the process, mostly, what people can expect in terms of cart checks and fines and so on. Again, we haven't issued any fines as of yet, and we hope not to. The idea, again, like Selena said, is really all about education and preventing people from using their recycling carts as an additional trash cart, because that's really what's happening a lot. And that was exacerbated, again, by COVID, where people were at home more. So a lot of the commercial waste shifted to residential, and people did not increase the size of their garbage cart. So as a result, all the overflow of garbage went into their blue carts. So, and as you can see, we're not talking about little bits of food on containers. We're talking about really egregious practices, chairs, carpet padding, and things like that. So that's really what we're concerned about. All right, so in terms of the cart checks, right now we're not literally flipping lids and looking under into people's carts. The drivers can see when there are loads like you saw there where the lid is open. It's stuck open because there's something holding it up that shouldn't be there. In those cases, or also they can see, they have cameras in the backs of their trucks. So as the load is going in, they can see that there's contamination. Of course, at that point, it's sort of too late, but at least they can note it and make a note for the following week and just be on the lookout for that. And that goes for recycling as well as the organics. Yes, and so again, this is what we're looking for on a residential load like this. The driver can spot it very easily, of course, and he's not going to pick that up. So what he has to do then is call into dispatch, and they send a garbage truck. So it means another driver going out, another vehicle going out to pick up that specific residence load. Same with a commercial load like this. This is clearly wish cycling, and it would be nice if these crates were recyclable. Unfortunately, they are reusable, and they were putting them in the recycling. But we followed up and encouraged them to reuse them. I think we referred them to the food bank, in fact, because they regularly have that. So how clean is clean? Again, we're not talking about little stuff so much, but for those who really want to do a great job, we would like to see anything like a pizza box like this with some grease on it going into the organics cart, not into the recycling. Similarly, for the aluminum pan you see in the upper right, it's best if it doesn't have food remaining in the pan. It doesn't have to be completely spick and span, but it just can't have actual food in it anymore. And the jar on the lower right is kind of marginal, I'd say, but it'd be best if the person at least wiped it out with a paper towel and then put that paper towel in the green waste. Okay, in terms of resources for people who want to do better and or have questions about what goes where, whatbin.com is an excellent resource. And so they just type in the material and it'll let them know where to put it. And I've noticed that it's pretty good at giving people alternative language if they're kind of not sure what to call something. We have recycling guides, which we've sent out to every customer at the beginning of the year. We'll be doing that again in January. And we also provide them as needed throughout the year. We have a new FAQ webpage, and the county also has, I think, new information, correct, on your website?
No, we'll just be linking the contamination FAQ page that Recology created, as well as additional resources we see. But I'm sure many of you have seen through Facebook and maybe some personal emails that residents have sent businesses about concerns on this contamination campaign. So a lot of those reoccurring questions that we've been seeing online, we put in this FAQ webpage to answer some of their concerns. So if you see additional questions residents are having, please send those our way and we'll add those to the FAQ page as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So regardless of whether a customer or a citizen goes to the county's website or ours, they'll end up in the same place. And then we have my Waste Zero team. So it's myself and 3 waste specialists, Waste Zero specialists. And so this is actually not my team here, but it shows the kind of thing we will do. We can go out to businesses, take a look with their permission at what's going on and what they might be able to do in terms of reducing waste. And then we provide these containers. This is not required and they are expensive, but we will provide free internal containers to businesses to allow them to sort more easily at their business. And then we provide posters as well, trainings with the employees and so on. And we'll keep coming back too when things, when there's sort of a touch-up needed. This last year, and some of you who are on the local task force have already heard about this, but we did the art poster contest last year, once again, or this year, and it was actually a combination of last year and this year because of the schools being closed. Anyway, this shows the gallery that we've created, so you can go there and see all the winners. There were 15 winners. We had over 118 entries.
The most we've had in any year.
Yeah, by far. A lot of great artwork by the kids. And we actually featured all of them on our gallery, not just the 15 winners. However, the 15 winners' artwork will go on our trucks, and those will be out there in the community for most of the next year.
And one thing I'll add about youth education, it is so important to us and to Recology. We've been doing school pilots, specifically trying to educate on this Recycle Right campaigning efforts. And so all of our pilots, we're telling them to recycle right, so that in hopes they can take it with them to their homes.
Yeah, and in fact, just this week, the Boy Scout camp was happening. And so rather than just providing them with a dumpster, essentially, which is what they've gotten in the past just for trash, we actually provided them 6 different stations with the carts that they have at home so they can put that together and see, okay, we're doing the same thing at camp that we do at home. Okay, here's an example of one of the Trek signs. This is one of the winners. And Antonella did a great job. Here's some other highlights over the past year. We added staff. We have an additional staff, actually not staff person that is not required in the franchise agreement, but we wanted to really have a robust team to do all those sort of follow-up calls with people and do those trainings and so on. We updated all of our outreach materials and the website, and we've been able to keep everything going during COVID, including things like our bulky waste pickup, which a lot of other companies stopped during COVID. Also, we've adapted the youth outreach. We've started calling it youth outreach, first of all, instead of schools outreach, because we realized we needed to get beyond just the schools since they were closed. So we're going out to the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the library. We're doing a fun thing with the library. We're doing story times with Miss Anna there. And we also participated in the eco-literacy program. So we're helping a whole consortium of green-leaning organizations and individuals in the county to create this for local kids. We've done a lot to get the word out about our low-income rate program, including a flyer that went to the, we distributed it to the food bank, and also the county helped distribute it to other sort of key locations where there would be low-income people perhaps interested in that. It's on our website in 3 locations. And thank you so much for calling our attention to that broken link. We've fixed it since then. And you were absolutely right. There was a problem there. If you clicked on the picture, it worked. But if you clicked on read more, it didn't work. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for fixing it. I appreciate that.
Sure. Let's see. We now do something a little different. It used to be that we would try to persuade the companies, our commercial customers, to enroll in all 3 streams. And it was sometimes hard to get them to do the organics. Now we're just kind of making it seem like, hey, this is just par for the course. This is what we do here. So when a new customer comes to us, we just automatically enroll them in all 3 streams. And if they have questions, of course, we answer them. But a lot of times they're coming from other places where they had that anyway. So they're usually happy to do it. We've augmented our abandoned waste collection services. So abandoned waste, essentially illegal dumping. Okay. We all see it out there. So our drivers are now on alert for that. There's a procedure for letting dispatch know, and then they can send a truck out to collect that illegal dumping, that abandoned waste. We've provided a lot of free organics collection and also compost to local schools. I guess I just should move on quickly. There's more to say about all of these, but I'll just keep going. And also to the Growing Hearts Garden.
Yeah, a lot of nonprofits.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, we've also provided containers. When we say containers, we're talking about big, 20, 40-yard roll-offs for the cleanups that happen along the creeks and other locations in the county. And we also were able to continue environmental days. So that's where we give away compost, collect e-waste, electronic waste, and do secure paper shredding and recycling. So that was a little tricky to do during COVID, but we managed to do it. So I'm really proud of that. So that's my contact info. And of course, Selena's, if you want to reach either one of us. Always happy to hear from you. And I just want to say, I started with the Recology a little more than a year ago. It was May 1st of last year. And my background, I've worked in the waste industry for almost 30 years, but I never worked on the hauler side. I worked for government, and then I worked as a consultant. And I really I never was interested in working for a hauler. But when I saw this post and I knew it was with Recology, it was something that I was willing to consider just because I have such a high esteem for Recology and have seen what they do in other communities for so many years. So that's what persuaded me to apply, and here I am.
Recent resident of San Juan Bautista, right?
Right. Woo.
Well, I'm glad you're coming to the job with passion, because right now in the community, there is an issue with Recology and its past reputation. So with someone like you at the helm, I think you're going to do wonders to help develop the relationship and get a better rapport with the community. And I thank you for fixing that link about the low income and so quickly. I appreciate that. As you're going through the presentation, and you showed the dumpsters that were, well, the recyclables that were slightly overloaded, what would a resident do? Like, say, for example, with that chair, if they broke down the chair and bundled the wood, can they still put it in the blue container if it wasn't overflowing?
It could go in the organics container, not the blue
Okay.
container. In that particular case, I was quite involved, and so we were really encouraging that gentleman to donate those chairs, because
Right.
they're beautiful chairs and they're in perfectly good condition.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened is that he would just make them smaller the next time and put them in the blue cart, and then smaller in the blue cart. But really, they needed to go in the green cart. So
Organics,
that was
okay.
the issue there.
And then that one tablecloth one where you had the red picture. Now, because I'm in this position, I have to be a model by, through what I do. And so everybody in the family is laughing at me that I'm really trying to do what I need to do. And so it's a chore to really organize what trash goes where. And like I said, my grandkids are even laughing at me. But I'm really trying to be very, very mindful. However, when I put my garbage to the door, I'm abandoning my garbage, and I've done my job. But I see people, on the night of recycling night, of, garbage collection night, there are people walking around the neighborhood, little shopping carts, little carts, and they are going through recyclables. I have seen a mess on the road because of the mess that they're making, and then I have seen them pick up the garbage, whatever has fallen to the street, and just put in another one. So then someone like, say, for example, me, I'll use me as an example. Well, I know I put it at the street in all the proper containers. I'm really being very, very diligent. But then the consequence to me or my household, 1, 2, 3 warnings, we're going to get the charge or the fine. What does a homeowner do in cases like that? Because again, I don't want to stop someone from going through recyclable, because once you put it to the street, you're abandoning all further use of that item. But we all know people go through the recyclables. They're trying to take it and make money off of it too. But what does a homeowner do in that case?
Yeah.
Because then that becomes an issue where it's out of our control, but yet the consequences will come back to the homeowner. So.
Well, we do offer locked containers, so that's something we could do. Yeah, what you're talking about is very common everywhere. In some places, they really do enforce the scavenging, because once those materials are put out, they're actually owned by the hauler. But most places, it's not enforced, because we all know people who are doing that are in desperate need of that little bit of cash that they get from the recyclables. So we can put locks on the containers if that's a continuing issue. Generally, that happens more with our commercial customers. So it happens with the dumpsters, not so much the carts, but we can put them on the carts as well. And we do that in public places, and I believe in some cases with residents where it's an issue. Yeah.
And then we have such an old neighborhood that we belong in, that the neighbors use each other's garbage cans when theirs is full.
Yeah.
So I went out to go put a load of garbage in the bins, and I'm like, what the heck? They're full to capacity. So I have no control of what my neighbor is putting in mine, or he, and that I might put in his. And so,
Yeah.
and I know these are what ifs, but they are happening.
They're real, and they happen every day. We
Yes.
had a case like that this morning, and so what they're able to do is tell us the address of the neighbor, and we can contact the neighbor. So,
We're trying to be neighborly,
Of course,
And
yeah.
if ours aren't full, there's no issue. But if they're
it's like,
if they're unintentionally putting them in the wrong bin, we don't want the consequence. And I'm just one household in the community, and I know that it could be happening elsewhere. So
Yeah.
those are just concerns that I'm hearing on Facebook, social media, phone calls, and so forth. But I really appreciate that device, What Bin. That little query, that was pretty cool. I shared that on Facebook, because I just found it very, very helpful in terms of what bin it goes into. So I thank you for
very
that.
straightforward.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any other questions, gentlemen?
Madam Chair, so what you're saying is grease and bits of pepperoni pizza aren't recyclable?
Right, exactly. Should go in the but we do want that in the organics. part.
Yeah, no, I'm
Yeah,
kidding.
Okay.
So I just generally, I think the tagging program makes sense. It's unfortunate we have to come to that, but there's really, there's really no other way of doing this at this scale. But I do think as far as outreach, the whatbin.com website, I just took a look at it. It's really, really nice website that Recology, or webpage that Recology has, and I would encourage using that in the outreach, and also just residents to use that if they have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, when I was looking at those photos, I was worried I was going to see one of my bins. But thankfully, it wasn't the week I put the carpet in the bin. A couple questions. I know you said we're at 34% contamination in 2020. What's a good number? I mean, there's going to be some contamination. What are we targeting? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So sort of the other side of the contamination coin is diversion. And so we're always hoping for, 50% or more diversion. Yeah.
I'll try to take a stab at that one. So ideally, in a perfect world, contamination would be at a 10%, but even our neighboring cities and counties are not at that level. They, prior to COVID, they were ranging anywhere between, I think it was 15 to 24% as well. But then along the start of COVID, the whole region that's taking their material to the Marina Recovery Facility was averaging 30%. So we're slightly above that average. I think, my personal opinion, a realistic contamination rate that I think is reasonable would be 18%. That's what we were seeing at some of the cities and counties in other Monterey region.
Okay, thank you.
But just to be clear, in 2020, though, regionally, it was 30%. So San Benito County was only slightly higher than the entire region, and you tied with Carmel, I believe.
Another question. This is just really my own curiosity. You talked about China and how they're not taking nearly as much, and I know that's in other areas, so that's affecting recycling around the world. I've read where, even things that are not contaminated, stuff that is supposedly recyclable, often does not find its way into really recycling, and it ends up in the ocean or other places. Can you comment on that? I'm just curious, is that correct in some cases? Because obviously we all are trying to recycle and do the right thing.
Right.
But, I'd rather see it go in the landfill if it's going to, some of it may end up in the ocean, for example. I'm just curious where things are globally with this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a massive question, but
I know.
And certainly there's very little of that material that's coming from a landfill or from anybody's recycling carts that's ending up in the ocean, and people aren't actually dumping it in the ocean. It's just blowing, or there are other ways, or it's being littered and so on. So it's hard to know what all those sources are.
I'm really talking about stuff that goes in recycling,
stuff that
is recyclable in theory, but
yeah.
So everything that goes, I guess the different way to ask it, everything goes in that blue bin that's not contaminated, that's recyclable, does get recycled.
If it's on your guide, and so plastics are the main issue. Plastics 1 through 7 are accepted in the program. 1s, 2s, and 5s have a pretty solid market right now. Anything else doesn't have a great market, but it's really just those plastics. So not everything that's marked recyclable is recyclable, and that's really an issue of there not being enough regulation and enforcement of what the companies themselves put on their packaging. We certainly don't have any control over that. So there are a lot of products out there that say they're recyclable that aren't. So you really have to look for those numbers 1 through 7 if you're talking about plastics. And then in the other cases, I'd just say refer to your recycling guide or what bin to know what's truly recyclable.
Okay. And I should know this, but does it on our website and elsewhere, does it get into the specifics of plastics and the 1 through 7 and what is?
It does say 1 through 7, yeah. It doesn't get into the markets or any of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that. So when any of the recyclables go to the Marina Materials Recovery Facility, any of the residuals or the contamination is being disposed at the Marina landfill. It's counted towards our tonnage, though. Any of the plastics that are being actually recycled and processed and cleaned and recycled, my understanding is all of the recyclables are being handled domestically, but our paper and cardboard are being shipped. So I think, items that would potentially come off of the ships that are being taken to these countries in Asia or wherever. I think you said Mexico, Shauna, once. Those would likely be paper and cardboard. But again, domestically, all of our recyclables are being
Yeah, the estimates
recycled
are that
here.
it's going to take 10 years or so before we have enough onshore, processing capabilities. All that infrastructure still needs to be built. There was an effort to include recycling and reuse also in the infrastructure bills that are currently going through the legislature at the federal level. I don't know where that has landed at this point, but we just don't have it here because for so long all those materials were shipped overseas. Yeah.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Public comment, do you want to?
So obviously there aren't any in the chambers. Are there any on Zoom?
If you'd like to make a comment on Zoom, please press *9 on your phone or the raise your hand icon on your screen. No comments on Zoom.
So that'll take us to the next item. That would be item number 45.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We'll go ahead and defer this to County Counsel, Barbara Thompson. This item's out of her office.
It was regarding
Sorry.
the county wished to look at a countywide fireworks ordinance. And I know that Mr. Bedolla from the Hollister Fire Department is here, and if he could possibly present, to start with, an overview of the results of the July 4th weekend, then I can go into the draft ordinance, which is an ordinance, which would be a countywide ordinance, which would prohibit all fireworks in the unincorporated area of the county.
Hi, this is Charlie. I'm sorry, I kind of poofed out a little bit. Just wanted me to give you an update on the weekend, on the fireworks weekend.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
That'll be affirmative.
Okay, okay. It switched over from the, my Zoom switched over, so you kind of poofed for a little bit while you were talking, so. Okay, yeah, this fireworks weekend, it was obvious we ran hundreds of calls for service for fireworks leading up to the 4th of July, and that was from pretty much from June all the way up to July and even after. And a lot of it was law enforcement calls for service. We did start patrolling for illegal fireworks a couple weeks prior to that, a week prior to that, also hard. In all aspects of the community, we were San Juan Bautista, the county, and the city of Hollister. We're just overwhelmed by the amount of personnel. I believe the city of Hollister gave out 26 administrative citations for $1,000 each. San Juan Bautista has, I believe, between 3 and 5 administrative citations pending right now. They did beef up their enforcement of the area. And they have some pending right now, and they do even have an arrest that was made also for someone that lit one illegal fireworks off into their restroom at their park over there. I think it's important that we remember that illegal fireworks is a zero tolerance. So when we do go out there and we do enforce it, it's known that it's a zero tolerance, that there's no warnings. We just confiscate and cite. Because a lot of the times the people are taking the warning and they continue on with the stuff that they have left over with that. So that way we know that they know that we do mean business on this. With that, I mean, all agencies are overwhelmed with the enforcement of the illegal fireworks. And San Juan Bautista has an old ordinance that says it's not allowed, but they made an exception, I think, this last time for regular safe and sane fireworks. And as we all know, it's a lot easier to enforce the illegal ones if we didn't have the safe and sane ones. So I guess that's where it brings us up to now, where there was some talk of banning the fireworks in the SRA, which means from Tres Pinos and out in the country out, but it came back down to it just to banning the safe and sane in the unincorporated areas of the county. That way we can hopefully lead our enforcement and concentrate our enforcement in the city of Hollister. But with that, I would recommend if we do end up banning the fireworks, we ended up getting together with the 3 different jurisdictions and hosting in a large fireworks display / festivity, maybe the airport. And then maybe if people that do buy fireworks that live out in the county that aren't allowed to use them, have a place, safe area where they're able to go light off their safe and sanes, possibly the airport. So I know there's been some talk about that. I don't know for sure, but in order to help the enforcement, because there have been more complaints than there have been people for the illegal fireworks. So that's where we're at on this part right now. And I believe there's still some wording, and since this is the first year San Juan Bautista started citing, and we'll have to strengthen up the county's ordinance so we could cite and know who we're gonna, I guess we would give the authority to give the citations, whether it's criminal or administrative out in the county too, and hit it hard the next year. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
And I also defer to the ad hoc if you want to present any information.
Thank you. Well, I'll just make a few comments. Supervisor Kosmicki and myself looked at this closely, along with the help of Barbara and her staff and Charlie, Charlie's input on this. We looked at the possibility of just banning all fireworks, including safe and sane, in just the, I guess it would be the outside of the county controlled area, the community controlled area. So potentially we would allow them in certain neighborhoods of the unincorporated areas of the county. But as we dug into it deeper, we realized that it became very complicated, and it would be very hard to communicate. And the fact of the matter is, most of the areas in the unincorporated areas of the county, even if there's neighborhoods, they are larger acreage in many cases, and so there's the opportunity for greater opportunity for fires. So, and then just furthermore, I think as a committee, we feel strongly that given the great fire dangers we have, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better. If anything, it's probably going to get worse. That it's frankly irresponsible, I think, to have any kind of fireworks in the unincorporated areas of the county. As Charlie was saying, hopefully the community could find alternative places for people to set off, either set off their own fireworks, or we would have, of course, our own events. I know that it's an issue, particularly probably in the city of Hollister. It's an issue with nonprofits raising funds through selling safe and sane. I know that is a concern, but I think if we go forward with this, and then if potentially the cities follow suit, then I think it would be the responsibilities of the municipalities to help find ways to augment the nonprofits' revenues, so they don't have a hit on their revenues, because they obviously provide really important services. So we're not trying to hurt those people, but I think we do have to look at fire danger, and it is a big issue. And the last thing I'll say is, as Charlie mentioned, the complaints we're getting with fireworks is just, it's more and more. And I'm reading a complaint on one of the neighborhood pages just in the last week, and they're still dealing with illegal fireworks. So, I mean, this is not just a 4th of July issue. This is getting to be, almost a year-round problem. And so it's something we feel that strongly that we have to do something about it. Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you. I'll just echo mostly what Supervisor Tiffany said. I agree. We talked about this obviously on the ad hoc. It's just getting more and more out of control every year, it seems like. And I don't live in the city, but I live in the San Juan area in the country. But over the way there, over the fields, you saw this spectacle. It was pretty unbelievable of illegal fireworks. So the way I kind of see it is that, I understand the detractors are going to say, well, you're talking about illegal fireworks. These are safe and sane fireworks. Why are you punishing people who are using the safe and sane fireworks? I think there's two things there. One, I feel like the people that have used these illegal fireworks, they don't seem to care about the law or the safety of their neighbors in their community. And frankly, they've ruined it for everyone. Because like Interim Fire Chief Badola mentioned, one of the main factors here is that by banning safe and sane, you're making it a lot easier for the fire department to enforce the illegal fireworks. There's no more question marks when they get these calls. Is it safe and sane? Is it illegal? That's the biggest factor in my mind. The other factor that I believe is that safe and sane fireworks aren't necessarily safe and sane. And, we got them this year. I have a 13-year-old. We got the safe and sane to try it out. I'm surrounded by farm fields. So there isn't a danger necessarily with dry grass. But I can tell you my experience was that they shot up in the air. I don't know what the evolution of the manufacturing of these things has been, but they shot up in the air quite a bit more than the very minimal restriction that essentially they're not following the rules, in my view. Secondly, I had a couple of these fireworks shot off right at me. I had to duck. I was a good 20 feet away from the thing, so that tells you how far they shoot. And it shot past me and right toward a giant oak tree. And we were off on the road, far away from the house. We had our water bucket and all those things, which, by the way, it tells you if you have to have a water bucket in these things, that it's not necessarily overly safe. But it fired right at me. Fortunately, I'm very athletic, and I ducked. I'm kidding. And right at the oak tree could have gone up in flames, and then the house could have, so they aren't necessarily the safest things in the world. And, we are one of the few jurisdictions that still allow this in the region. We're also we have a lot more open space than some of our neighbors where they don't allow them, and dry grass and all these things. And we have fewer resources than our neighbors that don't allow them to respond to these issues. So, again, makes it safer for public safety. To me, these aren't necessarily safe or sane. And I think it's worth the sacrifice when you weigh the benefit of banning safe and sane in the unincorporated county versus the downside of it, which obviously, let's hope that our community can come and help some of these nonprofits. But we can't, and if we're looking back after a disaster, we saw what's happened in other communities. Entire communities have gone down in flames. So we don't want to be in a situation where we look back with regret. Why didn't we just take this step, at some point? To me, we have to do it. And then hopefully it's really put on the city of Hollister at that point. I think it's up to them to decide at some point whether this makes sense for the city of Hollister as well. And I would agree, it would be nice to have a large fireworks display at some point. And it's something that I think the county could hopefully partner on. I don't want to see us paying for all of it, but if all three jurisdictions maybe come together, that would make sense. And then the only other question I have is I'm wondering about enforcement and if there's a way to, I know it's not that simple to just hire on people to do enforcement, but if there's a way we could somehow beef up enforcement, maybe pick a year just to really send a message, I would certainly support that. Thank you.
I know that the with the county including the Safe and Sane fireworks as an inclusion into this ban, I agree with you. It will be easier for law enforcement to determine any firework then is illegal. I know it's going to create some issue with families who really want to have that. You know, it's an annual ritual, but I think you're right that if we can get some sort of county city joint project where we do a nice firework, you know, display to go ahead and show and celebrate with the community, that might offset it. I absolutely love fireworks. They're beautiful. I'm fascinated by the colors that shine. For years and years we had passes to Great America, and I would just make sure we would go on the nights that they had the firework display. But I also understand about the safety issue. We are still hearing them going off as recently as this week on Monday, and they're still those loud bang ones where we know that they are illegal. You can feel the whole house vibrate. And so I would love to see that put a stop to, because I wouldn't want to see anybody's house go up in flame because of somebody else's negligence, blatant refusal to follow the law. And so we have to do something in the community. We can't afford to not. So I very much support this.
Can I make a comment real quick?
Yes, please.
So on the enforcement part, we do staff up a lot of people on there, and people have just gotten creative in finding ways of basically being untraceable when they're lighting them off. So that's also additional what's going on. I mean, if we have the PD that staffs up the weekend prior to that, when we have the rally, non-rally going on, and sheriff's deputies too. So I mean, it'll be easier for us if we hit it hard, if it is banned, and all three agencies staff up and be able to go out there and enforce it. I mean, we'll set up a task force to be able to enforce that. We could get together, and there's plenty of time to plan for that. And in addition, I think it was really nice that some of the communities like Santa Clara County, they actually pass out and advertise where each big fireworks show is going to be. So we just advertise for the community and make it a little festival on that too, also a possibility too. But I thought it was a great idea to advertise where the fireworks shows, whether we do one or we do two, it depends. But I think that was a great idea too. So I just wanted, there has been enforcement, but everyone's gotten creative on how they're lighting off the illegal fireworks. I'm not going to say how, because that'll just add to the ways that they're doing it. But we're finding it very difficult to being able to find them on the way they're lighting them off also. So that's all I had.
Madam Chair, if I could just clarify something. So the board is taking two actions today. One's adopting the resolution regarding CEQA, and then the other one is accepting introduction, waiving reading, continuing the ordinance to August 10th. And so I did note that there was one finding on the Exhibit A, which was just to clarify a typo, basically on the last sentence of Exhibit A, but it's already been uploaded into Novus, and it's the revised fireworks ordinance. So that's the one that the board would be taking action today. And also, when staff was going through this with the ad hoc, we carefully looked at all the CSAs within the county and how the population was disseminated within the county, and it was determined that this is the best way to do this because there's so many areas that are residential in the county that have interfaces with areas that are more rural that have greater fire risks. So.
Okay. So then, can we go to public comment then? Yes. Okay. So do we have any comments on Zoom?
If you'd like to make a comment on Zoom, press star 9 on your phone or the raise your hand icon on your screen. No comments on Zoom.
Okay. So then, and there are not any public comments in the chamber. So what is the wish of the board then?
I don't have it in front of me, but I'll make a motion that we approve the ordinance.
Accept introduction, waive further reading, and continue till August 10th per staff recommendations. Fine. Per staff recommendation.
Accept staff recommendation and waive the reading and
Continue it.
continue it to August 10th. Okay.
And also adopt the resolution.
And adopt the resolution. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and second that. All in favor?
Aye.
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 3-0. So that takes us to item number 46.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
If I may, I'll go ahead and get started. This is another item out of the Economic Development Ad Hoc with regards to the American Rescue Plan Act funding. And there's been some work that staff has been doing, really just dissecting all the Q&As and the updates from the feds on what we can do with this money. Ultimately, that's really what we've been working on and kind of waiting on. And there's been some releases as of late. And we have Gabriel Orozco here. He's our budget officer. He's going to go ahead and be presenting this particular item for your board and just have an open discussion with you as a whole and get some direction from your board. Again, there's still some things that we're looking at, and I'm sure there'll still be some more things that will be coming to light from the feds, but for now, this is what we're going to go ahead and put out. We just want to have some dialogue and get some actionable items and some input from your board so we can start working on some of these things. So, Gabriel?
Yes. Good afternoon, board, chair. I almost said good morning. That would have been interesting. So as CEO Espinosa mentioned, there is a lot of information that's been coming down from the federal government in the form of the interim final rule and FAQs, frequently asked questions, that they've been releasing on some eligible uses of funding. And what we have here today is a presentation on a little bit of the background on it and some of the eligible uses and ineligible uses of the funding. So a little bit of background. The funding became available March 11th, 2021. President Biden signed the American Rescue Act plan into law. California received about $26 billion. Our county is set to rein. The funding is going to come in the form of 2 payments. We received the first one in early June, which is a little bit over $6 million, and we will then be receiving the next payment in 12 months' time. The funding comes with an execution period of December 31st, 2024, so we get about 4 years to spend this money. And that's just to lock in expenditures. If we have projects that are continuing past December 2024, the performance period does stretch until 2026. So it gives us a little bit of time in case there are some projects that need a little bit of time to fully vet themselves out and process throughout. So as I mentioned, one of the key items is the interim final rule. It's about 150 pages. It's pretty much what set the funding aside. It's a set of guidelines as to what are the uses of the funding coming to the county. They also provided a comment period which just closed July 9th, 2021. This let the counties provide some information to the federal government in the form of areas that they had some gray kind of area where they were feeling like, wait, hey, is funding available to be used for this or that? And it really brought about an open discussion with the federal government in terms of where we could potentially spend the funding. And then from that, they were then releasing FAQs to the general public, so everyone knew that was receiving the funding, some eligible uses, some ineligible uses, so we can kind of begin to formulate an ID on what are the uses for it. So the initial direction given by the American Rescue Act was primarily to respond to the COVID-19 emergency and its negative after effects. So that's one of the things that you'll actually see kind of reoccurring throughout the presentation and the use of funding, is that it has to be directly tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. If it's a project or a program that you want to implement that has no real ties to the COVID-19 pandemic, then it could be something that wouldn't be allowed, because the federal government will view it as a project or a program that's in a form economic development, not directly tied to negative ties of COVID-19. So that's what makes it a little bit difficult and hard, but we try to kind of maneuver our way through this to make sure that we can, put together projects that are tied to some of the eligible uses, whether if it's looking at potential infrastructure investment in sewer, water, or maybe even some broadband infrastructure to make sure that we're able to address those areas of concern in the county. One of the bigger areas that spending is going towards is supporting public health response, whether that be medical expenses, COVID testing, PPE purchases, or enforcing public health orders. I know we just had a new COVID variant and there's been changes to the way they're enforcing it a little bit more. California just went back to recommending masks in places. I know the governor of California, Governor Newsom, was just requesting that all state employees needed to be vaccinated or if not, tested regularly if they refuse to get vaccinated. So these are all implementations from the state side that potentially our American Rescue Act funding can go towards to fund these areas. One piece that is apart from capital expenditures in other areas, you can invest into infrastructure as long as it's related towards monitoring and making sure that you can make public facilities operational and mitigate the spread of COVID-19, whether if it's making sure that public-facing departments, let's say our tax collector, they need to put up screens to make sure that there's a division between the public and the staff, things like that that help mitigate safety both for the public and for the staff. Things like these would be okayed expenditures because in a way, like I mentioned before, they're tied to COVID-19. So that's one of the areas that we're going to be looking at. Big area that a lot of people are looking at, especially in different counties, is looking at addressing negative economic impact in the county. They are, within this piece, directly looking at provide assistance to families directly, whether that is in the form of providing money for households that have lost income, they've lost their job, they are facing issues related to food insecurity or housing insecurity. So the federal government is really trying to reach out to the communities that are being affected the most by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's one of the things that they're really reaching out to do. And that's one of the reasons that on our side we're being very careful and diligent at where we kind of spend these areas, because as I've kind of mentioned it, a lot of the expenses have to be tied back into COVID-19. So that's one of the areas that we want to make sure that if we are looking at spending money in different infrastructure, different expenditure avenues, that we can tie those back into something related to COVID-19. As I mentioned, they go after making sure that we're directly looking at serving the hardest hit communities out in the area. As I mentioned before, it could be in the form of housing assistance, whether that's navigating them through housing and affordable housing, looking at housing vouchers, residential counseling, or there's even areas and application of the funding that go towards relocating families that were, let's say, in a lower income, lower economic development area, or lower economic development area to a little bit of a higher one. So that's kind of beginning to show that there was disparity between how different families and households, fared through the pandemic, and what this funding is kind of geared towards is to provide some sort of support for these families to make sure that there's something for them, whether that's providing childcare for families that had to leave their job because schools are closed or their daycare is closed. So things and programs that are set to be able to support these families is very important. Definitely homelessness being one of them. A key area for this is a lot of that is tied to a lot of services being provided to the community. Outreach definitely to the homeless population, try to get them connected to services and anything that they would need. Another of the key areas of expenditure is related to premium pay for essential workers. Right here I have a quick summary on some of the workers that would qualify for that, and some of the and now talking a little bit about the time frame, the majority of the expenditures, the federal government is requesting that expenses happen beginning March 1st, 2021 going forward. This is one of the areas where they're actually allowing the county to reach back. So to the beginning of the pandemic, because the federal government does realize that a lot of employees have been working constantly, and definitely putting their, their own well-being on the line, working as essential workers from the beginning of the pandemic back in 2020. So this is one of the areas that they're allowing us to look all the way back in case that there are essential workers from that time that we want to recognize and provide some essential pay. One piece that for us was very interesting and something that I'm looking at is replacing lost public sector revenue. So this is the form that the federal government was able to kind of provide the counties that definitely saw a drop in taxes or other forms of revenue that would qualify for them. And this is what they would account for as general revenue. Anything that is kind of like a special revenue or something that isn't form of a general form of regular revenue would not qualify. This is kind of their formula and how they would backfill. So essentially the way that it would work is they would look at a base year of revenue of the revenue that would qualify. That would be considered a base year. They would take that and then grow that revenue forward. If we didn't hit that growth target in our county, then we would be able to backfill some of it. One of the reasons that it's a little bit difficult for our county to use some of our ARP money to backfill some of this money is because in our county specifically, a lot of our funding is related to property taxes. And as we know, properties have just gone up in value so much, and a lot of people have been purchasing and selling houses. So property taxes have just been going higher and higher and higher. I know that most recently, this past week, our assessor completed the 2021 fiscal year tax assessment, and it looks like we grew about 6.7%. The growth that we're showing here to replenish is 4.1% as a minimum. So in a way, even within just our property tax itself, we're above our growth rate. So one of the reasons that makes it hard for us is in the way that they're looking at replacing this revenue is they're looking at it in general, so in total, meaning that I couldn't, pick and choose. I had a drop in sales tax, let's fill the sales tax. They want it in total, so if I had a drop in sales tax but my property tax was higher, it kind of offsets at the end of the day. So it makes it a little bit hard. But what it does do though is that it's going forward. So let's say potentially 2-3 years from now, we have a drop both in property tax, hopefully that doesn't happen, and sales tax. Then if our projection is below what we would project on what we're receiving, we could potentially in the future look at restocking some of that. So I know that's something that a lot of counties and jurisdictions have been doing, is sheltering some of that for future use, depending if they're expecting a drop in taxes or in revenue in following years. So that's something that they're actively looking at. And that's something that a lot of our neighboring counties, Monterey and Santa Cruz County, did have and experience a very large drop in revenue due to majority sales tax, because they have a bigger tourism base and they have a lot of space related to a lot of people coming in and out. So with these areas that they did suffer a high drop in sales tax, they're able to kind of push a lot of the funding back into to backfill a lot of this loss in sales tax revenue. It's something that they're able to do that on our end, being more property tax heavy, it makes it more difficult for us to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the infrastructure areas that they do outline. It does let us do investments into water and sewer infrastructure. They want to make sure that we're addressing and prioritizing our communities where we have identified issues related to water, clean water. The two guidelines that they want us to do, and like I mentioned kind of at the beginning, the federal government didn't provide a lot of instructions, but on this water sewer side of it, they did say if projects follow the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Water State Revolving Fund, SRF, and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, if we have projects that fall within these guidelines, they should fall within the guidelines of expenditure within American Rescue funding. And here I have a couple of potential water/sewer projects that have been kind of mentioned around in different jurisdictions and communities and counties. So whether that is a project related to water treatment, whether it's related to water system consolidation, pollution management, making water conservation, or a water reuse project. And in a way, one of the key areas that they're showing also within some of these projects is they're also, in a way, also trying to tackle our climate change issues that we're having here in our planet. So one of the key components of that is making sure that if there are projects that we're looking to move forward on, that we're tackling, if it's in one way potentially helping out the climate and the environment, that they have projects that are geared towards those. And a little bit later on, kind of towards the end, we have a budget on some potential projects, and I know one that there's been a little bit of discussion within ad hoc and with the RMA department, is the potential for a water treatment plant in the North County. Keeping with the infrastructure, broadband, one of the areas that we can spend funding in. On this one, the federal government did provide some guidance into what type and what kind of broadband. They say they're willing to provide infrastructure. And if it's infrastructure, they want it a little bit geared towards the last mile projects. They're not opposed to doing middle mile projects, but what they would really like to see is that final step, really getting that connection to the households, not kind of leaving it half unfinished, which for me, it kind of makes sense on the way the federal government thought this through, that the project, they don't just want us to go out there, lay the line, but the line's laid, but there's no connectivity to people's households. So it makes sense the way they're making it happen. They're not opposed to counties partnering with private companies to make sure that some of this gets taken care of. But at the end of the day, they do want to make sure that that last mile is being addressed. So here we have a little bit of a quote from the FAQs saying, under the interim final rule, recipients may use payments from the funds for middle mile projects, but the Treasury encourages recipients to focus on projects that will achieve the last mile connection. So making sure that if we do fund a middle mile project, there's at least a partnership or something that'll get us that last final mile. I know one of the big things in the county is we've been looking at partnering with RCRC, making sure that there is a strategic plan in place. I feel like that's a really good starting point, because that could potentially put together a strategic plan for the county, so we would know which areas in the county are underserved, and making sure that when that happens, we can then potentially put some funding, either some funding through broadband, if it's on the federal level or potentially on the state level, towards projects related to making sure that we can provide some better connectivity to households out here in the community. Another area that we're looking at potentially addressing is homelessness. Here are some potential uses that we have for homelessness. They provide emergency rental assistance, homeowners assistance, housing vouchers, hotel vouchers. A lot of these different funding avenues are more geared towards services, and that's one of the things that more recently I've been seeing a lot of counties move towards providing a lot more services. At the beginning, when the funding came out, a lot of counties really started running with the money, trying to do more infrastructure related projects. I know that's one of the things that we're kind of moving towards at the beginning as well. Later on and more recently, I've been seeing a lot of counties defer some of this money in ARP side for other purposes, whether it's other water projects or broadband projects, in turn of using state money. The state and Governor Newsom a couple of weeks ago signed into law a bill that will effectively give $12 billion to the counties and jurisdictions for them to use towards homelessness and homelessness projects. That includes about $6 million towards Project Home Key, which could directly go towards purchasing and furnishing new projects and housing developments related to homelessness. So I feel like that would be a really good project, and I know with CEO Espinosa, we're actively talking to our lobbyist, Michelle, making sure that we're definitely going to be reaching out and looking at receiving some of this money. And actually some of it's going to be allocated towards the counties. It's not money that we're going to be needing to apply a grant for. It's going to be allocated to us. The state's going to put together a allocation distribution for the counties, and I know there's probably going to be some grant opportunities for us. And I feel like this is going to be a very good project on the state side to put money towards. Another thing that we could do is we can transfer funds. So if we find a local partner out here in the community and we feel like they can put together a program for us, whether that's helping out local community, local businesses that are still reeling from COVID-19, we can do some transfer funding towards them for them to run the program. I know we did a little bit of that with the CARES money, where we provided some funding for local partners for them to fund programs here in the community so they could help out businesses. So that's something that we can do. Here I have a summary of some ineligible uses that have been already mentioned in the FAQs or the interim final rule. They don't want any of this to go to debt servicing. They don't want any of this to go to emergency funds or rainy day funds. They don't want it to go towards infrastructure outside of the ones that I've mentioned and they've mentioned in the interim final rule. They do allow it in case if you designate it as funding that went towards lost revenue that you then repurposed as funding going to another project. So that's one of the areas where we've seen if we're able to capture some of that lost revenue, we could potentially put it towards road infrastructure or other projects here in the county. So as I mentioned, some of these ineligible, there's more things that we can't use the money on that we can use it on. And that's one of the biggest restrictions that we have with this ARP money. A lot of the guidance that the federal government has provided has been a little bit, it hasn't been complete in a way. There's a lot of gray space where they're kind of leaving it up to the county to decide. For some of the projects, they're saying for the counties to use kind of their best judgment to see if whether a project is eligible or ineligible, leaving it in the county's hands. At the end of the day, what we want to make sure is that we don't end up recouping the money back to the federal government. So within the plan and the act that was passed, there's sections of it, section 602C and 603C, that provides information as to if a county does use the funding for an ineligible purpose, what the process is for recoupment. And it provides timelines and notifications in the process as to potential repayment in case the county uses the funding for something that we're not eligible for. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're proper stewards of the funding, and we're making sure that we're accountable and making sure that if we are spending money towards a project that it is an allowable expense. That's one of the reasons why we've been kind of holding back and we haven't rushed out to begin to do a lot of these different projects, is we want to make sure if we are moving forward with the project that it is an allowed project, and at the end of the day we don't end up losing out and having to return these monies back to the federal government. With this funding, one of the key items in making sure that the federal government is keeping tabs on the counties and local jurisdictions is they're making sure that we're putting together some reporting back to them, letting them know exactly what we're spending our funding on. Our first report for us is due August 31st, 2021. There are different levels with reporting depending on the size of the counties and the amount of funding that was received. Bigger counties, obviously receiving more funding, are actually held to a tighter standard, meaning they're required to report more frequently and more in-depth reports at what they're spending their funding on. Us not receiving a large amount, we did receive a big amount, but not as extensive as some of these other counties. We have to also provide reports, but not at the frequency and not as in-depth as a lot of these bigger counties that receive more funding. One of the areas that they do allow for expenditure is that they allow for consulting or managing expenses for some of this ARP money. So if we decide to bring in, let's say, a consulting company to help us to see about potential uses or different projects here in the community, for us to vest out and see what the local interest is in the community towards different projects, that could be an expense that is funded through ARP for us to kind of see what the feel is in the community about needs and what we're looking to do. So for right now, this has been our tentative budget that we had put together. We received $12 million. What we had in rough estimates on a water treatment plant was roughly about $7 million, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. I know this is a project that we had put together in our fiscal year 21-22 budget. So it's on there, and if we decide to move forward with it, it's a planned project and rough estimates on expenses. As I mentioned, we still hadn't vested out a lot of potential possibilities for the funding. So the other two areas that we had on here was our county support in housing, which was related to our tent city. Based off prior discussions that we had with the board, that item is, I would assume, abandoned based off the location where it was supposed to be at the jail. So that funding will now probably revert to other uses as unspent. The other piece, our housing, our homeless shelter expansion related to a property. That one was the one that I was kind of mentioning a little bit before earlier in the presentation, where the federal government, well, not the federal, the state government is coming through with a lot of funding. And I think it would be appropriate to use state money to fund a project that is right related to something they want to do. On the state side, it's a little bit more clear-cut. The money is specific for funding and revamping and reusing facilities to make sure that we're able to provide homelessness services and shelter for some of these individuals here in the community. So what that would potentially do is free up another $3 million for us to then use for other uses. Other uses, as we kind of discussed a little bit earlier, would be related to anything that related to COVID, whether that's putting together a economic revitalization of the community related to areas and industries that saw a lot of drop in revenue or saw a lot of drop in people using them. So a lot of these plans that are being put together, and actually it's one of the things that a lot of counties have been putting money towards is actually funding a program that could have potential in the future to provide revenue generation and provide an infrastructure and a framework that could withstand future economic impacts. So right now, a lot of counties have been putting money towards a lot of industries that have suffered a lot of damages, revamping them, restructuring them, making sure that there's adequate and enough structure to make sure that we can continue to grow that industry and potentially lead towards future economic development in that side. As I mentioned, this is still a tentative budget. We're planning to move some of this around, and as kind of like our staff recommendation, we're asking the board for some guidance and potential prioritizing eligible expenditures, looking at some areas that you may want us to do a little bit more research in to see where eligible expenses could go towards, provide just a framework for us to work with, and then come back to the board with some more examples, some potential options, and potentially some projects that we could use the money for. And that hand it back to the board.
Okay, so do the board members have any comments on this? I do want to go to the public, but I do know that there was a email from Dr. Michelle Huntoon that I would like for Jennifer to read into the record. And I know that Supervisor Tiffany just mentioned something that, a text that we both got. So when we get to the public comment, I want to make sure those are in, so, but go ahead, Supervisors.
Madam Chair,
If you have any, yes.
can we take a 5-minute break?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Is that okay?
Mhm.
Thanks.
Okay, 5 minutes? Okay, so that takes us to 3:40 on that clock, 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you, Colin. Rescue Plan monies. And so we're opening it up to the supervisors before we go to public comment.
Madam Chair, if I may, I was sitting this morning jotting out the different notes I had to talk, and it just was growing and growing, just for brainstorming. And so I actually printed it off just so I don't just rattle through.
Okay.
I'm not trying to dominate the conversation. It's just so you have in front of me what
It's
I'm,
our conversation.
what
so
I'm
that's
gonna,
okay. Yeah.
you know,
Okay.
what I'm about to rattle out.
Oh, thank you.
Some of these are probably more throwaway, but thank you. So just generally, my general thought on this money is that this is like a once in a lifetime, probably once in a generation, whatever cliche you want to choose, opportunity with money to spend really what I would prefer on, mostly on sort of one-time expenditures. I don't think we necessarily want to go down the path of creating additional ongoing expenses. And so, first off, I think as far as the process going forward, what I would suggest is that we sort of have a priority list of sorts for the funding. The one thing off the bat that I think we should definitely do is replenish our general fund with what we've spent because of COVID. I just think that's sort of the core purpose of the ARPA legislation, and I don't think the county should take a financial hit when this is right in front of us. So I would suggest off the bat at least $2 million, because it's $1 million that we've at least already spent, and then looking forward, anticipating the potential for further losses, especially with the Delta variant. I would say at least $2 million of the 12.2 should be set aside for the county's general fund. And beyond that, though, what I just gave the other two supervisors and the clerk was just a general list, and some of these things we already talked about. So the wastewater infrastructure, we have that budgeted for 7. I know Director Shambles has said that could be as high as 8, but let's just say it's 7. Homelessness, farm worker housing is something that I put on here for discussion. Broadband, the vaccine incentives that we discussed at the prior meeting. I'm a strong proponent of that. I would really like to see that in there. So I think as far as dollar amounts, I'd like to discuss broadband in a second here. I know there are going to be some further thoughts on that. Vaccine incentives, my initial thought is somewhere in the range of $500,000 for Supervisor Gonzalez mentioned $200 incentives. I think that number, maybe that does make sense, but that's going to get you a couple thousand vaccines, basically. I would also suggest considering a local lottery of sorts. I've thrown out $50,000, $100,000. So out of those people, those next couple thousand people that get vaccines could potentially be open for additional incentive dollars. And then COVID testing. Supervisor Tiffany brought up testing. If we're going to go down the path of requiring our employees to either be vaccinated or get regular testing, we're going to have money for that. And so I would suggest, and I support that. I do. I think that's another day discussion, probably, but it seems to make sense that that's the direction that a lot of the other organizations throughout the country are going, is to either require having vaccinations or testing. And then, so to me, those are kind of the core items. Beyond that, though, so my thought here is that the $7 million on the wastewater plant, we don't even know if we're doing that yet. My thought was to pencil it in now and then have a secondary list of priorities that we fall back on if in the event that we don't do this wastewater plant. And for the public's knowledge, what we're talking about here is something that's an economic development opportunity, where we constantly are running into issues with infrastructure. We're trying to recruit new businesses to the county. We've particularly looked at the North County and the area near the airport that's in the county as an area that we might want to entice future development for commercial and industrial. Unfortunately, we don't have sewer service, water service, and we've run into issues negotiating with the city of Hollister as far as hooking up to the sewer plant. And we can take that whole negotiation part out of the process if we build a wastewater plant. in the North County. And I think there would be a lot of interest from the business community, and it would really set us up, I think, for many years to come to really have a great tool to recruit business. So that's my thought, is that we set aside 7 for wastewater, and then we basically have 5.2 to work with. The broadband part of it, it's tough because we don't have a specific. I'm not a big believer in just picking a number. I'd like to see some further examination of what specifically we're going to do aside from the plan. We're working on this plan right now, the master plan. We could potentially reimburse that dollar amount off the bat, but then, I think we just need to do a little more homework on what we specifically want to do. I'm one supervisor, but I don't support just writing a check to the Monterey Bay, the MBEP organization. I don't support that because historically we've gotten the short end of the stick with these regionalization approaches, and I just don't trust that having the accountability there that we're going to get out of that whatever dollar amount. I think they asked for $4 or $5 million, and a lot of organizations are coming to us asking for money, and it's not a never-ending trove of dollars. So we have to be really careful about just saying yes or no to different entities that are asking for money. But I don't feel comfortable with that approach. I just don't, as I stated already. So I don't know what the dollar amount might be with broadband. Again, I don't like just picking a number, but maybe we fill in the gaps. Maybe it's $2 million for now, and then looking at a secondary list. If we don't do wastewater, that would open up a lot of these other things that I've listed here. And the other thing I want to say about broadband and homelessness in particular is that the state and federal governments are putting a lot of money into broadband and homelessness. So I think there's a balance here that we have to really consider, as far as just knowing that I think we should put some money into those areas, but I also think we have to consider that we have a lot of other things where we could potentially use these dollars, and that we probably will be getting significant dollars for broadband and homelessness in the next couple of years as well. I'll just rattle off a few of the other ones that I've listed here for the supervisors, so I'm not leaving the public out of the dark. In the area of tourism, I've listed off, I'm a big proponent of promoting Pinnacles National Park more. We could start with a sign somewhere, a monument sign. That's just my own personal thing that I've been pushing. We have the regional park and River Parkway. That falls into tourism. I think that would likely be eligible. We have a big price tag there with our regional park and our River Parkway. Where the money could go. I've just an idea, event. We have a lot of events in our county. We could potentially do a grant program for these local organizations so they'd have some dollars to promote these events to outside areas, particularly. The same with local facilities. We could do a grant program for tourism related facilities. I gave El Teatro as an example there, if they would like to potentially use money to renovate their facilities. And then this other category I have is this is just throwing ideas at the wall here, but offsetting residents' rates for the ecology increase that we're looking at. The memorial that Chair Gonzalez brought up for families who lost members to COVID. The grant writer program that Supervisor Tiffany brought up. We could hire a grant writer for 2 or 3 years with those dollars. Project-specific grants, the Sunnyside Estates Park, people came in talking about relief payments for low-income residents, although that would probably take a huge chunk of the money. The really far out there one I have here is Aquatic Center. That's something we all want, the community wants, I know badly, and I think that could fall under a tourism, economic development type of a category. And I had the library on there, but I think we talked about the COP previously, and maybe the COP approach makes more sense with that. But that's kind of the just putting a lot out there. I know that's a lot, but I just this is a brainstorming session. I also will add, we might want to consider having. There's a lot of community interest on this issue. We might want to consider having a study session of sorts or something where we particularly are inviting the community to come in and share their input on how we spend these dollars. And then just really quick, I just want to go over my notes just to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. I think that's it, but just the main thing that I really want to emphasize is that I really do believe we should replenish the county, what the county's had in losses. I think to me that's the first thing that I would do. Thank you.
Good.
Okay. Great input, Supervisor Kuzmicki. A few comments, well, a couple questions first, and then I've got a number of comments. Once again, how much time do we have to spend this money?
So we have until expenditures until December 31st, 2024. If it's say something that we spent money on already, as long as it's delivered by December 31st, 2026, it's okay.
Okay. And then piggybacking on Supervisor Kuzmicki's comment about first priority backfilling that money that we've already spent for COVID related, we're hoping that much of that money is going to be backfilled, whether it be through FEMA or other areas. I guess strategically we can look at, see whether that money comes through, and if not, then we can backfill. I mean, am I right in that in theory what we spent, most of it will get backfilled, or is that not correct?
Most of it will be backfilled through FEMA. Is that your question?
Well, or wherever it's appropriate.
Yes, that's, yeah, and again, there's timing. We were working with staff this morning on that. There's some things that we, that potentially may or may not be approved through FEMA. So I know the CRF was also something that we were going to use to cover some of that as well as this potentially could be used. I think what Supervisor Kuzmicki highlighted, I think, is a really valid point, and I think we need to basically lift every single rock and make sure that we cover the general fund. That's a priority. I agree with that 100%. So there could be about $1 million there or take on duties that were done. Assignments was strictly related to COVID. A good example of that is the hiring of our public information officer, David Westrick. That's 100% COVID. And that's something that we could do if it's not fully covered through FEMA and through the CRF. We can still pick that up on the other part. So those are things that we really need to make sure we cover and verify. So hopefully that answers your point.
Yeah, it does, and that's exactly right. I think we absolutely should cover the general fund, but also, we should obviously where we're getting backfilled from other sources, then that leaves us more money here. I think that and I agree with many of the same things that Supervisor Kuzmicki has listed here. What I would say is that I think we need to be very strategic with this money. We have a great opportunity. It is maybe once in a lifetime kind of amount of money, over $12 million, which is a lot for our county. The good thing is unlike the other COVID money, we have time. Now, there are some immediate needs, and I'm not suggesting we just sit on this money for a long period of time, but at the same time, since we have until December 31st, 2024, I think we need to make sure we see how things evolve in certain areas. Broadband might be a good example of that, where we're through the RCRC grant, they're going to be coming up. Hopefully, if it goes forward, we'll be coming up with a strategic plan for broadband, but we may not know, as was pointed out by Supervisor Kuzmicki, we may not know today where we might use some of that funds, but a year from now, we might know. I think, so anyway, I would see kind of a two-step process. There's some immediate needs, COVID-related needs. I absolutely agree that we should potentially look at some of this money being spent for vaccine incentives, maybe for the testing, as was discussed. The fact of the matter is, the state now, and it was just announced today that President Biden announced that they're going to require all federal employees to be vaccinated or to be tested. I'll repeat what I said in our last meeting a couple of days ago. I believe that all county employees should be vaccinated or tested. I think we should look at that. I think we need to we're one of the major employers of our county, and I think we need to set an example. And you know, unfortunately, it may be that, you know, it's obvious we're anything but out of this pandemic, so who knows where there will be additional needs to support potentially businesses if things slide backwards, hopefully not. Nonprofits may continue to, you know, have needs as well. So I think in the immediate term, there's definitely areas that we need to, you know, that we need to spend money on. But at the same time, I also want to be strategic with this. This was, Supervisor Kosmicki mentioned this, I think this is very important. And you brought this up, Gabriel. There's a ton of money out there right now, both state and federal. This money's coming from federal, but statewide, broadband, homelessness, and other areas. And I really want to make sure that we are leveraging, you know, our lobbyists and Michelle, and you know, looking at grant writing. You know, and I'm just repeating this, I realize, but you know, why spend our own money, the 12 million, if we can get a grant or we can get money from, you know, the state? So we want to make sure that those areas that we can get money from, in other areas that, you know, that we're saving our own money for other areas that it's not going to come. So I think that's a big part of it. Looking at the budget, $7 million right now, and I want to emphasize to anyone that's listening in, this is just a first cut and a tentative plan that we're looking at. But obviously what jumps out is the $7 million of the 12 million for the water treatment plant. It's a big chunk. And so even though I am fully supportive of us continuing to explore that, and you know, I'm a business person, and I'm all about trying to bring in more business development, and this could be the way that we could really, you know, really invest in our infrastructure to take advantage of that. I think it could be a great idea, but I also at the same time feel that we need to, you know, be looking at other alternatives as well, because if we don't do that, you know, we want to be ready, you know, where else are we going to spend that money? Whether it be broadband, homeless. Now, can this money be used for property purchase? If you're dealing with homeless, for example?
That's where it gets a little bit tricky. So part of the funding needs to be, one of the slides mentioned it. If you had a revenue loss and you're using that as, let's say we had a drop in sales tax, property tax, business license, we can use that backfill money for property purchase, other purchases outside of the normal infrastructure. So on the general fund side, what we would be using is that backfill loss in funding to put towards projects. For example, this project. If the project goes through and it goes up and running, we can use it to fund operations, because at that point we would be providing services to the community. And whether that's in the form of getting them connected to other resources, being in the area that we're looking at, it will serve more or less like a hub. We have Health and Human Services, child support is now out there as well, food pantry, the original homeless shelter right there. And as I kind of mentioned in one of the slides, a lot of the counties are gearing a lot of their funding towards properties and looking at potentially funding these kind of operations, but they've geared it more towards services now, because they're looking at the state in all this billions of dollars that they've just released, which is about 10 times more than they've ever put towards homelessness. So a lot of the counties are more deferring it to the state.
Right. Okay, thank you. And then, you know, and I know it gets tricky, but we're confident that because I think of sometimes infrastructure, some infrastructure, for example, a wastewater treatment plant or broadband, are not necessarily tied to COVID, but nevertheless, it's clear that this money can be used. I mean, I know it very specifically says it. There's no concern that that's going to be an area of a question if it's not somehow connected to COVID directly.
The water project?
Yeah, water
Yeah.
or
So
broadband.
yeah, so the way that the interim final rule kind of spells it out, if you're putting something together, in our case, we're trying to put a water treatment plant, if you're going to be providing something where you're going to be enhancing the water quality or what you have out there, I know Mike may have some more information as to the potential issues that there are with the current system that they have over there, and more or less the city system that they have over there, and what a water plant in that area may alleviate and provide potential benefits to the community. And that's one of the big pieces. The IFRS interim final rule is wanting us to take a holistic approach. You could, in putting a water treatment plant there, benefit local businesses and provide for possibility for business development and economic development in that area. But if you were to put it right now, what's the benefit right now? The local community benefits right away. If you have families that live out there that their septic and everything is maxed out, or they're having issues, what this does out there is provides direct support to them. Mike, I don't know if you have more information.
So this is very preliminary, and I plan on bringing a full report back to the board after a couple more tasks are complete. One of them is the information about the Clean Water Act. I want to talk to our consultant and make sure the project will meet it. I think off the top of my head, we're going to be there because there's a long list of direct benefits to doing something in that area. It's high water table, septic tanks, wells are contaminated in the area. If we get people off septic in that area, that reduces the nitrate load, and that's an immediate positive environmental effect that can be attributed to the Clean Water Act. Additionally, you got the creek running right through there. Sometimes you have septics overflowing into the creek. You get the septics out, that solves that problem. There's the potential of business expansion in the area. There's really nothing out there to handle it. We already have several large businesses out there on septic. Get them off septic, that improves things also. The plan that we discussed a few days ago, which actually benefits homeless, that also would be a direct benefit to this project. As scheduled right now, in approximately 2 weeks, I'll be meeting with the Water Board to have the first really in-depth conversation with them about this project. And then once that meeting's complete, I'll be bringing a full report to the board to share with you our conversation and give you recommendations on how to proceed. I absolutely agree that you should have a backup plan.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Mike. And one other question, I don't know if this is for you, Gabriel, or Mike, but Supervisor Kuzmicki mentioned, for example, there's some smaller things that maybe it could be used for, for example, this issue we have with the park, Sunnyside Estate, or maybe, other parks. But it occurred to me, could this money, and I don't know if we want to go down this road, but could any of it be used for any CSA infrastructure issues?
So
I believe, I know the CSA infrastructure you're referring to, and I believe it would qualify. And then one other thing we're thinking about are some minor improvements to the HVAC systems to put ionization in them, to make the buildings healthier, not only for staff, but for the public.
Right.
And to reduce the possibility of airborne spread of vector within the buildings.
Yeah, and I don't know if, again, whether we want to go there, but there's both, wastewater CSA issue and a water CSA issue at the top of mind right now.
That meeting's scheduled for next week, so
Yeah.
I'll have more information after that.
Okay. Thank you.
To address, if you
excuse me.
mind giving me a second.
Okay.
Address the
Yes.
parks. So There is a question in the FAQs which directly ties into open spaces. The federal government did take into consideration that being that during everyone needing to quarantine and be home for long extended periods of time did take a toll on individuals' mental health and that and kind of being just by yourself. So there are there's some more information. I'll have to look it up, but there are some potential possibilities. So, for example, Supervisor Kosmicki and during the board meeting on Tuesday, residents that were talking about a park. Potentially, if the county does meet standards, with whether if it's, I think I was looking at the census tracking standards, then we could potentially put monies towards a park, open space. That could potentially be going towards that or to a regional park, but that would take us looking at it a little bit more into that kind of distinct area or potential spending opportunities. So we can look at that as a potential.
And then my last comment is I would agree with Supervisor Kosmicki's comment about some community outreach. This is a lot of money, and it's maybe a one-time thing, and I think that we should get input for more than just, our immediate board and staff people. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Madam Chair, if I may just add one comment, I know Supervisor Tiffany had mentioned, we have a good amount of time. I think your words were we have a lot more time than we did like with the CRF. I think that was the gist of your comment. However, I just wanted to highlight that building a sewage water treatment plant, it may not be enough time. So we just need to be mindful of the CEQA process, that there's just a lot that goes into it. So I think, I think having two options is really important. I really do. Maybe three options, to be honest. I think us continually working on this and working with all these items simultaneously. I don't want to lose out and we run up against the clock. And I just wanted to share that with the board.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting we sit. But that's where I'm talking about, being strategic, is that I think we really need to talk about, okay, what are the things we have? Maybe we want to wait a bit on some of this money, and where do we need to move quickly? I think you're right, the wastewater treatment, a decision is going to have to be made pretty quickly.
Right.
Very quickly. Right. Because it affects, obviously, everything else and what we have left to spend, but also because of the time factor. But anyway, we need to be strategic about it.
And I know, Gabriel and I, we're talking about parks for a period of time, and that is a good potential. I mean, obviously, I think people have realized broadband's been an issue, and also the mental health of individuals during COVID, being cooped up in their house and having a place for them to go. And I think the feds have realized that, we could use some of this money for that, for the Sunnyside, probably our master park plan that we have, and building some trails. So I think those definitely would qualify based on some of the Q&As and some of the what's been provided from the feds. So again, we have a lot of work to do, but we wanted to really get your input, and I really appreciate that. Supervisor Gonzalez still hasn't commented on it, but I think so far we've heard some good input. So thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to just thank Supervisor Kosmicki for putting this together, because you really pinpoint a lot of the conversations that we've had, so thank you for organizing it. As I went through the list, I noticed that we have an ad hoc for 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 of these items, the big items on it. So going down the list, the homeless and homelessness and farm workers and affordable housing, that can all be addressed, from the the ad hoc that's dealing with the housing. We have an ad hoc for the broadband, so looking at the RCRC and the strategic plan and the local task force, that will all build into a continuation of the conversation. We have the ad hoc for the vaccine, so that would cover the incentives that you two can bring back to the board. It would also deal with additional testing for county employees, possible the mental health aspect that Ray just mentioned right now. I really like that, and I do like the memorial aspect too that you mentioned there, Supervisor Kazmicki. As I said, I picked up the white flags. Those would be just a temporary memorial, but that would be nice if the community had some sort of permanent memorial to acknowledge the passing of all those lost souls. I do really appreciate the priority to replenish the general fund. That has been expended. And so I would like that to be the first thing that we look at to make sure that the county has replenished anything that is expended between March of last year, currently for COVID. We also have the ad hoc for the tourism, and I do like the idea about branding San Benito County as, the home of the pinnacles, and I really do want to take that claim to fame back from the other city down south who shall remain nameless, who has kind of, appropriated that title. But I hear you, and the parks, the regional parks, the local park that we talked about on Tuesday, the Sunnyside Estates, great plans. And so though, Gabriel, your presentation gave us a nice tentative, it looks like it's going to deviate a lot from, your presentation. But I agree, we need to have a community session, study session input. We need to have a special meeting where the community come in and we can give them something like this that Supervisor Kosmicki put together, and then the community can then, like to put a little bit more of their wants and desires. Now, we can't please everybody, we never will, but at least as we spend this one-time money, that it will be something, the consensus that the community can build off. And so I would like, because I looked at the recommendations and you wanted us to receive the presentation, what the eligible and ineligible uses are, check. Provide staff direction on the prioritization for eligible expenditures. So, and then again, developing the framework. So I think what we should probably do in terms of giving you direction is to establish some sort of time frame meeting where all 4 sitting supervisors can be present, and then we can open up a community, as Colin suggests, a study session. I put special meeting, it doesn't matter what you call it, but something where the community can come out. So those would be probably my 2 recommended priorities. And then in these series of meetings, and it can't just be one, it has to be a series of meetings, and we would probably have to go to San Juan to make sure the San Juan and Aromas population is able to attend. And then I would think also South County, somehow, some way, your location, Tres Pinos area, so everybody from your county, and we can make Hollister the central for all the other districts, but just make sure everybody has an opportunity to be heard and give input before we start spending. But as I said, there are broadband, homeless, the vaccine, the tourism, that are already set up in terms of ad hocs that we can just pull those in for when we start divvying up the funds. But thank you for this, I appreciate it. Yes.
Madam Chair, may I just add?
Yes.
Just, I think, as far as process, to me, we should, I agree with both supervisors and echo what Supervisor Tiffany said about really, I think we should have an immediate list, things we can identify now, a long-term list and of things that are likely expenditures, and then a secondary list for things that we fall back on in the event that we don't do the wastewater treatment plant. Because I don't know what the percentage chance is, but it might be 50%, it might not be. I don't know.
Right.
And we maybe, like you said, it might take a few years to do that. So that might be something we may have to look at bonding for or something along those lines anyhow.
Right.
If we even go down that route. So I would just suggest again, for the immediate, right now, I would say definitely plan to replenish the general fund if that's needed. I know Supervisor Tiffany was asking about reimbursements, but by replenishing the general fund, you're giving yourself more discretion. It's not that those dollars are going away. We can still use those dollars. It's just now we can use them on anything we want. But putting it on paper that that we X amount of dollars back to the general fund, we can still circle back if need be and use those funds. It's just doing that gives us more flexibility. I would do that immediately. I would set aside, for me, I would look at setting aside a good $500,000, or I don't know what the dollar amount is, but that's what kind of sticks out to me for vaccine incentives and testing. And then other than that, I would say the grant writer we have all talked about it and support it. So I would think that that's economic development potential. And I think that we could just pencil that in. If it was me, I would pencil in the memorial, and then everything else. I think we all support broadband. Let's be clear. I think the investment in broadband is extremely important. It's just a matter of working out the details there. But I think that's certainly going to be part of this. I would expect homelessness or something along those lines to be part of this. But like I said, I would say immediate, long-term, secondary, and work off of those lists essentially. Thank you.
Good. So we have I think, really good, clear, if that's the will of the board, we have a pretty clear direction. I think what we'll do is we'll work on this, and then we'll provide an overarching plan back to you. We'll come back again and then put in timelines. I think meeting with the public is going to be key as well. With funding we do have kind of left out of that bucket to talk about. So I think that'll be good. And we'll work on that internally and get back to you. Yep. Good. I really appreciate the feedback. It's great feedback. Thank you. And if there's anything else that comes up, please let us know.
Okay. Can we go to the public then?
If you'd like to make a comment on Zoom, please press the raise your hand icon on your screen or *9 on your phone. You've been unmuted. Please state your name and you have 3 minutes.
Good day. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Good afternoon, Board and Chair. My name is John Frisetta. I'm the Director of Information, Technology, and Accountability for San Benito High School District. I'm glad to hear you mention a community special meeting, but for now I have a sneak preview on what the needs are for allocating American Rescue Plan Act funds for broadband infrastructure and support. For the past few months, I've been working with Superintendent Michelle Huntoon of Aroma San Juan Unified School District, Mr. Wayne Norton, and others via San Juan Bautista Rotary's Internet Access Committee headed by Mr. Phil Esparza. The goal of our committee has been to identify students in need of broadband support and provide them with solutions within our capacity. We've been aggregating locations of families in need of broadband from both SBHSD and ASJUSD and have been able to create an anonymized map showing the locations of these families within our cities and county. I would be happy to share this map with the board if you are so interested. In response to COVID-19, our LEAs were given the funding to provide short-term solutions to these families, mostly in the form of hotspots, so they could participate in remote learning. However, these have not been an optimal solution, with major ISP infrastructure unable to adapt to the increased load, leading to frustratingly slow service for students, not to mention the struggles of those that live outside coverage areas. As students physically return to school, the scope of education as an internet service is ending. I encourage you to view our experiences as a microcosm representing the larger community. Between SBHSD and ASJUSD, we had just under 15% of our student population cite not having broadband connection at all. For each of those students, there are at least one and likely more disconnected parents, guardians, siblings, and other family members who live in a location without broadband. Imagine applying that rate to the rest of the county. Through the LEAs within this county, you have access to the beginnings of a needs assessment, citing real numbers and locations of citizens who cannot connect to or afford broadband right now. Our recent experiences with COVID-19 have only cemented our knowledge that connection to broadband is essential if we want our community to stay informed, safe, and active. Whether signing up for vaccinations, applying for positions of employment, researching and understanding the world around them, even now I'm participating in this meeting via teleconference. A lack of broadband is a tremendous barrier to actions many take for granted. Ensuring our community has access to an affordable, stable internet connection is a prerequisite for success. I hope that you see the value in collaborating with our committee and other local educational agencies to understand who in our community doesn't have a connection right now today. Please earmark American Rescue Plan Act monies for this purpose. Again, I'm happy to share anonymized maps that we put together with you so you can see the density of need within your own districts. Thank you so much.
You've been unmuted. Please state your name and you have 3 minutes. you've been unmuted.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Philip Esparza. I'm a resident of San Benito County, executive producer for El Teatro Campesino, and chairperson of the San Benito Rotary Access Committee. I'm speaking in support of a significant allocation of the San Benito County ARPA funds to support broadband plan development and implementation of a robust internet service at affordable cost for all San Benito County residents. As chairperson of the San Benito Rotary Access Committee, I would like to share with this board our commitment to work with you, county staff, the cities of Hollister and San Juan Bautista, and other regional public benefit organizations to help develop a detailed and cohesive broadband plan for San Benito County, which will identify and include additional financial resources from local, regional, state, and federal sources to ensure a successful conclusion to our joint efforts and plans. Again, this is a time to act with this allocation to ensure internet access at affordable cost for all residents and businesses of San Benito County, and especially our students, seniors, and underserved populations. Providing robust and affordable internet will also prove invaluable to your efforts to address many of the other challenges that this board is currently addressing. Working together, we can make this happen. Adelante, and thank you.
No other comments on Zoom.
Did you want
Yeah, Madam.
to go ahead?
Oh, go ahead.
We have one more comment for Michelle Huntoon. Dear Supervisors, thank you for the opportunity to provide a public comment today as a community representative at large and educational community. As you are fully aware, the need in San Benito County for critical infrastructure broadband is significant. My purpose today is to seek in support of broadband infrastructure. I am here in support of the future success of our businesses and community. The broadband infrastructure is essential to your community as it relates to the county's economic as a whole. It impacts the affordability of service for our citizens and future increased commerce and jobs for housebound individuals. Further, broadband will address the critical need for communication related to telemedicine, EMT, fire, and law enforcement. As you will hear today, the data shows the self-evident need in the community. I support funds to be spent on the broadband infrastructure in San Benito County for the purposes noted in my public comment, as it is allowed by the American Rescue Plan Act, signed by President Biden on March 11, 2021. Thank you.
Okay. Madam Chair, I'm going to read a text, some input comment that came from Wayne Norton. Wayne wanted to speak today on this issue, but had to go to another meeting. I'll read this to you. Wayne strongly encourages the board to set aside $5 million from the ARPA funds for broadband to serve the county. We know that we must address the equity issue of our day and close the digital divide to ensure students receive an education. And we know that broadband is important for rural health care providers to maintain digital health records. We know that telehealth is important for rural communities as well. And businesses like Amazon, really all businesses, depend on stable access to the internet. Broadband is a utility that is just as important as water or electricity. As such, Wayne hopes that the Board of Supervisors will set aside these funds, just as Monterey and Santa Cruz counties have set aside millions for broadband as well. And that's it. That's from Wayne Norton. Thank you.
Okay. I guess we're going to have to do too with regards to public comment, since all of us have business and personal phones. We have our constituents reaching out to us. So I would like to, when we finally get to that item 49 that we didn't get to on Tuesday, if we can add that as another bullet that's being addressed, because we all don't want to run across an issue where public and private conversations are going on, and I don't want the public to think we're doing something underhanded or anything of that nature. So clear transparency. So I think all of us as supervisors need to understand that message and be on the same page.
We'll make sure to add that into
Okay,
the language.
thank you.
Yes.
Yes, none of us want to violate any kind of proposal, procedure, law, Brown Act, or anything like that. Okay, and then when we do this session to look at how we want to spend this, I want to make sure that we make it a bilingual session, okay? Because we have to make sure that our all of our population that is housed here in San Benito County can partake in it. So, was there anything else you needed from us in terms of direction? I believe that was the last item on the agenda. Yeah?
It sure was. Yeah.
And it's not quite 5, yes. Okay, and then I guess too, along with that same comment about addressing, the phones, can we address when this situation happens again? Because it seems like as time passes, our agendas are getting longer and longer, and there will be time where we will not be able to squeeze it all in one course of the day. So when we have a continuation like we had today, I want the public to know from the get-go, whatever has been published on the Tuesday agenda, whether it's Zoom access or whatever, will apply. It's just a continuation. Because there was a lot of panic about how do they get in, how do they make a public comment, and I think that's kind of where these 2 last comments came in. But maybe if we can address that in our policy, because it seems like things are just getting longer and longer in terms of the agenda. So I'm just trying to look forward.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's part of some of the planning process as well. We have a lot of people that are presenting as well that are in the same boat. So, we'll talk about that. We'll discuss that in that agenda item. We'll talk about maybe having another day during the week or another day the following week for having another board meeting day. So we'll play it by ear. I think timing-wise, I think based on the agenda itself, if nothing gets pulled, we're pretty close to doing it in a day, if not, pretty around there. But
That's
when
a big
items
if,
start getting
though.
pulled and a lot of comments and a lot of other dialogue, which is great, that's what we want. It just, you're seeing it, and that it's just delaying it another day or half a day. So, which is fine. We just have to address it, and we can talk about that at the next board meeting. Yeah, in that item.
Just so the public knows,
Yes.
already what's happening, and there's no mystery, there's no illusion. It's a matter of fact, and the procedure has already been set up. So say, for example, on the 10th, when we have our meeting and we know that we want to get out of here by 5, 6 o'clock at the latest, if there's more additional information on the agenda and it has to be postponed, then the public needs to know, okay, they didn't finish it today, so then we know it's going to happen Wednesday. We know it's going to happen next Tuesday. But it's a set procedure, and there's no mystery, and then there's no, the supervisors are trying to have a meeting and excluding the public. And we're not doing that, but it just needs to be set in stone, and then that's the way it is.
Yeah, and we can go till 8, 9, 10, midnight as well. I think it
I
was
see
the
some heads shaking
difficult
no.
part was the clerk of the boards had a meeting that were up late the night before, and it just was.
Well, and I'm cognizant of that too, because
Yeah.
again, it's hourly employees, then we're really putting some
was
constraints on them
difficult.
as well, and that's not fair.
And again, this is obvious. Yeah, we can discuss that. It is obviously something that's not pre-planned by us to have a meeting that's going to go till 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And to be honest with you, we still have one more agenda item in closed session.
Right.
And that is something. It's up to your board if you want to.
I thought we were going to wait for the 4th seated board member so that way we can have a full board deliberate on that.
It's up to your board. what you
It's up
wanna
to your
do.
board. I was just going to
That's fine.
suggest
I was going to
that.
ask the same thing,
Okay.
Madam Chair. And if I may, I will say, I think when we hash over the board rules, that should help out, I think, somewhat on the timing. And it's, we're all new supervisors, but I think we all know it's incumbent upon us to rein ourselves in a little bit, all of us, and take that into consideration. I think we'll get there. I really do.
And I just sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important. You are all new, and so I think it's important for the dialogue, and that's why I think that's why the meetings are going on, and you're learning. There's still today, we actually added more information in the tax item because I really wanted you to understand about how it works, how COPs work, how our rating works, what goes on behind the scenes. All of those things matter and are important because what we invest in for maybe technology for the budget system has a real big play in what we get, what we potentially could get for COP in our ratings. So all of those things matter. So that's why I think it's important for you to hear it and learn a lot of these things. So we know that, we expect it. I think, it's going to take a year or two. I think after a while you're going to get it, and that's fine. It's all part of the learning process. So I think as time goes, though, the meetings will become shorter, and there are things that you're going to understand and get, and we'll expect it. But that's fine. And if we need to adjust that, we can adjust that for more meetings. So.
And one last thing, the 10th, just to keep in mind, us three are going to need to be in Sacramento that night for training. I don't think we should plan on getting out of here at 5 o'clock. We should definitely get out of here in the early afternoon. I talked to Sao Espinoza about that, so that we have time to get up there, get ourselves right together and get up there.
And there's already, I think, quite a bit that we've deferred. And so what we're doing is moving even that a lot of information and agenda items to the 24th, I believe. Yeah, so that's what we're doing. So we're cognizant of that. We'll do our best to keep that a light meeting. And the plan is to put the consent item at the end of the agenda so we can get through the beginning items. I think it's important we have people on standby waiting to present so we can have them go. And then usually the consent items are items that maybe department heads could talk to and other folks that can be on standby. So that's not a problem. So.
One last reminder before we adjourn. We adjourn in honor of Henry Solario. I had mentioned at the beginning of last time, just a former supervisor and public official. I believe he was a city council member as well. Passed away recently and came to my attention. Former supervisor Pat Lowe brought it up. I want to give her credit for pointing that out, and I thought that made sense. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Solario family, and I went to school with one of them, and I know Henry's been a significant part of the community for a long, long time, and of course connected with many other really prominent people in our community, and so thank you for bringing that up. I did want to mention before we adjourn, I really feel, I hear what you're saying, Supervisor Gonzalez, and I think we do have to anticipate if we run long, but I think certainly our goal should be to try to get these meetings in one day and finish at a reasonable time. Partly, not just for the county staff, but also, the public does, they do want to make comments, and if they have no idea when we're going to get to some matter, it could be, in this case, 2 days later, or it could be much later. I think the idea of putting the consent agenda at the end is a really good idea, because it will mean that we're hopefully going to get to the other things earlier in the day. But I think we'll get more public participation if they have a better idea when we're going to be getting to things. So I think it is incumbent on us to try to not do what I'm doing right now, which is talking too long. So anyway, enough said. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go ahead and take our moment of silence. And then I'll take a motion to adjourn when you're ready.
So moved, Madam Chair.
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Meeting adjourned, 4:35.
That's the first for me, by the way.
What?